Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this very special edition of Tales from Outer Space. More specifically, this is the 3-year anniversary TFOS. Not from the first TFOS, but from the beginning of this channel, so this celebrates that. Now, I would love to tell you what the exact date was, but I have no clue. I just know that it was at the end of last month and the beginning of this month, 3 years ago, that we kicked off on this journey. And what a fecking journey it's been. Some people have been around since the beginning. Some people are new, but you're all still very much appreciated. Now, for those planning the next couple minutes, this is a 3-hour TFOS in celebration of 3 years. So I hope you got your diapers on, something to drink, something to nibble on, and are ready for the long haul of stories. Now, this is a variety of stories, ranging from pretty much everything we've covered in the last few years. Happy, sad, science fiction, some fantasy thrown in. But before we get to the stories, there's one announcement that I'd like to make. As some of you know, I've been worrying about the demonetization thing, especially since it seems to have ramped up, even since the previous announcement. Almost all the channels that I've seen demonetized have had the same reason for the demonetization, and that is repetitious content, which is just fucking ridiculous. I think it's a ball of shit, and there is some seriously wonky stuff going on. But reading this policy again, technically my channel does fall within the violation of the policy of repetitious content. So I put my thinking cap on, I consulted the bones, the oracles, the future, and all of that, and I decided that the audio is unique, but the video is not necessarily unique. I mean, it is to us people, but it isn't to a computer. So how can we make the video unique without spending money? Because, you know, money. Thankfully, through some connections, I came across some actors that are willing to act out the stories. Now, with things being tight, we had to go on a budget, but thankfully I found an acting troupe that would work within my budget, that would help me, and they would gain benefits from it as well. Their acting troupe is called the Actors Guild of Fishtopia. Now, to the untrained eye, it might look like a tropical fish tank with fish randomly floating about, but I posit that the swimming is actually interpretive dance. I mean, you know, not dance, swimming, but interpretive swimming to the story. Yeah, we'll go with that. These are actors. They look like fish, but they're actually a different alien race that are working for me. They happen to look like tropical fish, but yeah, the aquarium is not actually an aquarium. It's a theater, and the fish are actually thespians. So we're good. It's original content. We have actors acting out these stories in their interpretive swimming style, so we're all good. So, for the love of God, YouTube, please leave my channel alone. I'm trying. I just want to narrate stuff. Why do we have to make this difficult? But anyways, you know, if life throws lemons at you, throw hand grenades back, adapt and overcome and all that stuff. So, this is the way it's going to be. We're going to have scrolling text at the top. We're going to have the acting fish in the middle and bottom. And we're going to shorten the intro a bit more. We're going to shorten the outro a bit more, so that hopefully we don't fall into the violation of the policies, because they're so vaguely worded that everything is a violation of the policies. So who the fuck knows? Not me. That's who, not me. Not a clue on this side. So we're getting inventive. We're getting preemptive. And hopefully we're not getting demonetized. But that's channel news. But on a more personal note from me and my family, what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank you guys for sticking around, for listening to the content. Thank you. I mean, I literally couldn't have done this by myself, because then I would just be a guy sitting in the room talking to myself. Now I'm that plus an audience, so it makes me a little less crazy. Honestly, from the bottom of my, my leg, because it's bigger than my heart, I thank you. My family thanks you. I never thought this channel would get this far, and we have, and that's all thanks to you, so thank you very much. Yeah, now on to the stories with our fishy brethren doing their interpretive swimming. Also, one of the other things, just quickly, I thought of maybe doing miniature painting, which I've never done before, as another thing to do instead of just having the fish. So if you would be interested in that, just by the way, my painting skills suck, then just drop it in the comment section down below and we'll be good. And more importantly, on to the stories with energy! And again, thank you. The sole method of negotiation. Humanity, what the feck? Ever since there have been big ships with valuable things in them, there have been opportunistic psychopaths trying to take it. In an age of sail, when our people plied the archipelago trade routes of our homeworld, piracy was so rife that it was a way of life for many tribes and nations. In the age of space, the vast distances and expenses involved in space travel made inter-system trade a peaceful affair. The ships were too big to loot and too slow to flee the Navy in. Of course, piracy did occur, but the Navy could track them and the hyperlane stations could block their escape. Overall, it was peaceful. My family have been traders ever since one cave dweller had a few more rocks than the other one. As sure as the sky is blue, my family has been on the decks of trade ships. As a consequence, my family tree has more than a few dead branches. Storms, war, and pirates are the natural predators of traders, but it is a risk we all accepted to be where we belong. My specialty is as translator and communications officer for ships traveling between racial borders. Merchant intelligence does a lot with the heavy lifting, but language is something no perfect system can hope to understand fully. And, depending on the temperament of the race, one bad translation can be one too many. At the moment, we were hauling cargo to the call systems and had exited hyperspace in the Sol shortcut. Hyperlanes aren't like highways. You can't build them between systems and expect them to work. I don't know the science, and the odds are that you don't either, so let's move forward. The basics everyone knows are that hyperdrives let you travel on hyperlanes, and hyperlanes are naturally occurring areas of space, allowing FTL travel along them. The borderline impossible to create, making the systems that do have hyperlanes incredibly powerful. It was the luck of the draw for many systems on whether they or not they had a hyperlane, until about 50 years ago, when some mad bastards pulled it off and got stinking rich in the process. This artificial hyperlane cut months or even years off of some of the journeys to the call systems and made trade a hell of a lot more profitable. The only issue was that the locals of the system used for the Sol shortcut weren't in a position to negotiate anything and got shafted pretty hard in the deal. They were primitive, though, so no one cared. There was enough for the tech difference between us and the natives that the trader leagues, i.e., the most powerful group in the galaxy, and my then employer, were able to get exclusive and non-expiring rights to the trade routes, the hyperlanes, and more or less whatever they wanted. The planet wasn't even negotiating as one party, so the trader leagues played the petty nations against each other. All this is to say the natives got bent over a barrel and weren't coming off of it anytime soon. We were 2 weeks into the Sol and the last hour of my shift when we were pinged. Someone had scanned us with infrared. I rubbed my eyes and checked the scanner. There were no military ships, and the nearest mega freighter was only just entering the Sol shortcut. Who'd want to ping us? A local craft, perhaps. But what would a native want with one of our ships? 4 days into our journey, we were pinged again. This time, we didn't need to look for the ship tag. Our short-range scanner picked up the unidentified group of craft approaching our freighter. We weren't a military craft, so our scanners could only pick up a mass and trajectory. The ships were small and fast, only 70 tons at most. I hailed the ships and notified the captain of the situation. We were 10 lanes away from the nearest space-capable planet. Nonetheless, the situation didn't sit well with me, and my gut told me something was off. Bear in mind, this was a gut honed by generations of mariners and traders who survived. This gut wasn't full of shit. Technically, it was, but you get the idea. 3 hours later, the captain and I watched the short-range scanner while we were on the sysnet with head office to figure out who the hell was on our tail. 3 ships didn't identify themselves, and though were now only a few kilometers away. In space terms, we were holding hands. Docking cameras were activated, and we got our first look at the mystery craft. Their silhouette didn't match anything in our database, and as we gained visual contact with their easy-to-figure-out why. The three craft approaching us were flying assemblies of scrap and DIY spacecraft. I shared a worried glance at the captain, who stood with a mug of Stimcane brew and focused on the scanner. He was ex-Navy, as far as anyone knew. Rumor on the ship said that he'd served during the Separatist Wars, but he never talked about it. All I knew was he had his share of burned feathers, and he ran a tight ship. When he gave the order for all hands on deck, I nodded and switched the alert. I don't know what we thought we were going to achieve. The captain cracked open the armory and handed out everything we had. The armory was only ever supposed to be used in case of mutiny or parasite infestation. He handed me a pistol and told me to hold the bridge. When I asked him what was happening, he looked me in the eye and said the most cursed word. Pirates. It was out of line and naive of me, too, but I spoke back to him. I told him it wasn't possible. The logistics of the lack of return, all our cargo was secured in ship, and it would take them days to haul enough to make their trip worthwhile. Even if they stole the ship, the Navy could catch them easily. 3 successive explosions told me how wrong I was. 10 hours later, that's what the first phase of the pirate takeover is like. The crew fled to the bridge and fortified it while our security droids tried to stop the pirates. One by one, they fell to primitive automatic slug throwers. There must have been 50 of them, all clad in makeshift body armor and vacuum suits. We huddled in the bridge with our weapons trained on the door and waited for the inevitable. They'd kill us or take us as slaves and steal what they could of the ship. We either weren't coming out of this alive or wishing that had been the case. We could see them on the security monitors setting up their own fortifications outside the bridge while a small crews took torches to the doors. Then we heard a voice we understood. His accent was rough and pronunciation lacking in areas, but we understood him. Those of you in the bridge, we have taken over this ship. As you can see, we are capable of and willing to use force to get what we want. If you surrender now and follow our instructions, you will live to see this through. If any of you fight, you will all die. Either way, we all get what we came for. The choice is yours. A sharp crackle of static ended the message. Our beaks went dry and our feathers fluffed at the implication of the message. There was no doubt in his voice. He wasn't threatening us. He was telling us. All beaks pointed to the captain, who already had his gun down. He pulled the capacitor out of his scattergun and tossed it to the door. Ukri, head of engineering, called him a coward and pointed his pistol at him. We all had our guns pointed at each other now. Was it fear or stress? I have an obligation, the captain said sternly. To the company, to you, to your families. He stepped towards Ukri without pause. Ukri was having none of it, though. The barrel of his pistol shook uneasily. Bull crap, he shouted. They're killers. We can't let them win. This isn't about winning anymore, the captain replied, still steadily walking towards Ukri. This is about survival. He was 5 paces away. You saw what they're capable of, he shouted. The captain was only a few paces away now. You can't seriously believe that they'll let us live. I don't have the luxury of belief. I have the facts. If we fight, we die. If we don't fight, we might live. We're outnumbered and outgunned. I'm making the best decision possible. He stood before Ukri, the barrel inches from his chest. Don't point that thing at anything you aren't willing to kill, he said, beak nearly touching Ukri's. The pistol fell to the ground, and the captain placed a claw on Ukri's shoulder. Defenders don't win sieges. We comply and wait for the Navy to get you. That was enough for the rest of the crew, who laid down their weapons and put their arms into the air. The captain nodded to me, and I sat at my station and activated the ship's intercom. The captain leaned over my shoulder and told the pirates that we surrendered on the condition that the crew not be harmed. The doors, now half molten from the pirates' cutters, opened. Hot strands of molten metal dripped from them as the pirates entered the bridge with their weapons at the ready. They were brutally primitive things, both the pirates and the weapons. Wooden stocks and stamped metal receivers, handled by bulky humans at every shade of pale, to as dark as the void outside. The last to enter were two humans, one in salvage power exosuit armor, and the other in a textile suit with a flak jacket over top. The crew were taken out of the bridge and kept in the rec room along with a large portion of the pirates. The captain, myself, and Yukri were kept on the bridge for reasons we weren't sure of. The suit was the one who'd spoken to us earlier and was now in the syscom at the head office. None of this made sense to me. Where was their hauling ship? Why weren't they looting the ship before the Navy arrived? The following is a transcript of the first call between the Helios Trader League office and Krutz's crew. Helios Trader League Syscom support, vessel 0559B. You are not scheduled for the call-in today. What is your situation? This is the Krutz crew. We have taken over the ship. I'm sorry, what? I am speaking on behalf of Commander Krutz of the Krutz crew. We have the crew of the ship hostage, and we will not release them until our demands are met. Please stand by. Hold music. Are you fucking kidding me? Chuckles. 10 minutes of hold time, pirates speak amongst themselves regarding negotiating strategy. This is Janet Randis, Helios Trader League President. Am I speaking to the Commander Krutz? You can call me Khan, chuckling in the background. I am speaking on behalf of Commander Krutz as his translator. We don't negotiate with pirates. I think you'll find that you do. And why would that be? Your manifest indicates that you have an excess of 200 billion in consumer electronics and industrial machinery on this ship. Go ahead and take some. The Navy has been notified. I'm sure that they need a target practice. We're not taking it. Why? Because at this moment we are rigging the ship's reactor with explosives. I'm sure you'll agree that radioactive consumer goods are severely depreciated. What do you want? 20 billion credits and Navy shuttle transport back to Sol 3. You're crazy, and you're running out of time. Call disconnected. I'd expected that the pirates, having failed negotiations, would have cut their losses and taken as much as they could. But instead, they brought their own crew aboard and made a hard burn towards Sol 3's orbit. They couldn't possibly be planning to steal the entire ship and its cargo, could they? The Navy took 2.5 soul-cleaving months to get to the Sol system, by which time we were past Sol 3's moon and sitting in high orbit. Even more pirates were brought on now, but they weren't armed with weapons. They were bringing food and drugs. I was told by Commander Krutz in his thick, half-legible accent to hail the Navy. The translator, who went by Khan, handed me a script and gave me a firm smack on the back. Once we had a secure line, I cleared my throat to read from the script. This is the comms officer, Nibia Yul. I'm speaking from vessel 0559B. We are being treated well, and any attempt to board or approach the ship will change that. There are 40 crew on the ship, but this can change if you attempt to interfere with the ransom exchange. The Navy kept their distance after that. For a week, the crew camped in the rec room while the pirates took shifts guarding us. The fear and adrenaline faded and was replaced with anxious boredom. The pirates had their own way of passing the time by gathering in a circle and taking turns with an inhaler. A thick blue smoke puffed out of their lips and lingered in the air long after they exhaled. After inhaling, the pirates would talk loudly and laugh at seemingly nothing. I'd only the faintest clue what they were saying. Their languages were, well, alien. I could understand little concepts and instructions, but not much else. Something of a personal failing for a translator. 6 months in was the turning point. The captain and I spent much of our time on the bridge. Being officers made us both valuable and a liability to the pirates. The most likely to cause trouble and the most expensive to replace if negotiations went downstream. Something that seemed likelier as the weeks ticked on. I was about to ask the captain if we were getting paid for this time as hostages when Yukri slipped into the bridge. This was the first time in a month that I'd seen Yukri. As chief engineer, he had to have been where I was sitting, but as, and I quote, the raptor-blooded badass of the crew, the pirates kept him isolated after he tried to start trouble. So seeing him, with something draped under his wing without a pirate escort, made my flight feathers rise. Captain saw him and bowed his beak. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is," he said in an already defeated tone. The two guards on the bridge were slumped in their seats with an inhaler hanging loosely from their fingers. They'd been out cold for 20 minutes, but we didn't dare do anything. It appeared that Ukri had. He unfurled his wing and revealed one of the pirate's automatic weapons in his claws. He winked at us. We were in so much crap. "How in the hell did you get that?" hissed the captain, not wanting to wake the pirates. "Stole it," Ukri said. "And thanks for the help, by the way. While you two were playing with your eggs, I was doing my part to keep us alive." The captain grabbed Ukri by the scruff of his neck. "By stealing a goddamn weapons!" He seethed. I'd hunkered down in my chair and tried not to exist. I wanted no part in the potential lethal clusterfuck that was about to unfold. Ukri pushed the captain away, jostling our cards and rattling the cups. The two pirates shifted in their seats but remained asleep. "They're just biding their time. The moment it becomes convenient to them, they're gonna kill us." "Then we best not make it convenient," the captain said rhetorically. "Like, for example, stealing their goddamned guns." Ukri sneered at the captain. "I'm starting to think that the medals you earned are tin," he snapped back. I imagine he wanted to say more, but then he suddenly stopped talking. I'd never seen someone go down faster in my life. The captain's wing was a blur, and Ukri made a gah sound while he fell to the deck. While Ukri was still choking and wheezing from a half-collapsed windpipe, the captain put a foot on his rifle and slid it under the chair of the guard, still mercifully asleep. As I built up the courage to ask the knife-hand-happy captain why he'd throat-punched Ukri, through pirates entered the bridge, and I could tell that they were not happy. For one, the tone was aggressive and possibly panicked. Secondly, they had their guns aimed at us, and thirdly, because one of them had one of our crew at gunpoint. "Where's the gun?" shouted the first pirate, the one with the hostage. The commotion was enough to wake up the guards from their narcotic-induced nap. They looked around and realized that they'd passed out and trained their gun on us as well. The captain and I raised our arms while Ukri just kind of struggled on the floor. The three pirates put two and two together and figured out that our guards were less useful than scarecrows. Choice words were exchanged and Krutz was summoned to the bridge. I winced. Krutz getting involved made the situation much more lethal. While I waited for Krutz to inevitably make our lives hell, I looked out at Earth. Grey ocean separated by ashen land while pale yellow clouds swirled. What an awful land, I thought. A fitting cradle for the brutes that kept us hostage. Krutz stormed into the bridge with a gun ready and Khan at his side. The captain, Ukri, and myself were stood against the wall while our guards were disarmed and dismissed. More choice words were exchanged. Between the threats and curses, I learned that they were being dismissed, sent home with half pay. Considering the scale of their mistake, I'd expect at least one of them leaving via an airlock. Khan leaned in close, forcing me to lower my beak. "We're all humans so tall." "Who took the weapon?" he asked. Credit where credit was due, his proficiency with our language was getting better. I chanced a look at the captain, who just looked back at me. Ukri stared at me with surprisingly pitiful eyes. The guard walked in with it, chuckling to himself. "I think he was smoking blue," I lied. Khan translated back to Krutz, who laughed and aimed a pistol at me. "Tell him if he lies again, I will see if he tastes like chicken." Khan opened his mouth, but I cleared my throat. "Chicken," I said, nodding. Khan smiled and resumed. "Who took the weapon?" I didn't know what to do. He could tell when I was lying. I didn't want anyone to get into trouble, let alone killed. Ukri was a dumbass and a blowhard, but he had family. Last he'd said his girlfriend had another clutch on the way. "I did it," said the captain. Ukri and I shared a shocked expressions and watched the captain walk forward, and I planned to take advantage of the unconscious guards to arm myself and take back the ship. I've clearly been defeated. He turned towards Krutz and looked expectantly at Khan. "Translate," he ordered. That was exactly what Khan did. Krutz looked at the captain, gave a respectful nod, and ordered the captain and I to stand against the wall. Yukri was motioned to stand next to Krutz. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. I should have done it. I should have pointed a feather at Yukri when I had the chance. Now I was going to die to save a stupid cloaker. "Get the company on videocom," ordered Krutz as he checked the hand cannon's ammo. Yukri looked petrified as both the captain and I glared at him. It should be mentioned that videocoms are expensive and that the pirates were calling collect. When Yanat Rendus answered, he was met by the footage of Commander Krutz with the pistol in hand. The captain and I against the wall, and Yukri standing next to Krutz, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. "We are getting impatient," said Khan in his methodically calm voice. Krutz shouted in his native tongue and pointed the pistol at us. Yanat, even backed into a corner, was a traitor, and a damn fine one at that. "You can't be serious," he screamed, while two handlers tried to keep him and his chair. "You haven't done anything. Let's talk about this like honest traders." "This is a reminder of what happens when you waste our time," continued Khan. Krutz's grin had pointed his gun at us. I closed my eyes. I couldn't see him, but I assumed the captain intended to stare Krutz down until the end. But there was no shot, no sudden nothing. I cracked open my eyes in time to see Krutz smash the gripped pistol in Yukri's skull. The poor guy let out an ear-splitting scream and fell to the ground, apologizing and begging for his life. I slumped against the wall, speechless and limp. The captain didn't say anything, but his claw was balled up hard enough for his palm to dribble blood. Krutz fired a shot from his hand cannon that he was so fond of waving in our faces. We all winced, by all but the captain, because he was stone-faced, cold-blooded professional. I peeked between my feathers. Yukri was huddled up in a puddle of his own filth, whimpering. "Mr. Randus, do we have an agreement?" asked Khan. I'd met Randus once when I was fresh-faced in the company, talked down to everyone he ever met, and was so up his own cloaca he couldn't see the sun. But to see him now, there he was, disheveled mess surrounded by an army of equally panicked lawyers and union reps. "Yes!" he screamed. His lawyers tried to shut him up, but he pushed them away, out of the way. 12 billion and the Navy shuttles to Sol 3. Khan cracked a grin. "Have it delivered on 3 transports. We'll open with the shuttle bay and count the money there. Once we have the money, we'll be taking 1 crewman per shuttle down to Earth. Several of our crew are armed with detonators. If we sense a trap, or you cross us, we'll detonate the reactor. If the credits are not 12 billion exactly, we'll blow the reactor. If you so much as sneeze without notifying us, we'll blow the reactor. When the shuttles are out of orbit, we'll provide a disarm code. The crew will be sent back on the shuttles so long as everything is above board." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The biggest trader league bending over and complying with a dirty band of pirates. There were 10 Navy frigates orbiting the ship, and yet these pirates held all the cards. My contemplation was interrupted when Khan grabbed me by the arm and told me that I was going to be one of the lucky crew to visit Earth. Lucky fecking me. It took a week for the money to be transferred by Syscom to the Navy frigates, and those frigates to transport it in 3 Navy boarding craft, just as expected. All the pirates were in vacuum gear, except us 3 hostages. Yukri was limping next to Krutz, who, in full vacuum gear, was actually less terrifying. The credits were counted by a batch verifier, examined the encrypted credits code to verify that the entire 12 billion batch was authentic currency. Satisfied, they stowed the credits in 3 drives and handed them off to Khan, Krutz, and their first mate. The Navy crew waited in their transport while this all happened. I'd expected a full assault squad to storm out of the transports and wipe out the pirates in one fell swoop. Make them know that the Traders League don't negotiate. But instead, the pirates boarded with us hostages in tow, and we descended down to Earth. Earth was tragic. We breached the cloud layer and were met by choking brown smog and bright cities sitting in the middle of thick, greasy clouds. Khan sighed and pulled a respirator out of his pocket. He looked to me and motioned to the window. "This is what you did to us," he said, with that same steady tone of his. I don't know why I snapped back at him. Maybe being so close to freedom gave me a spine. "You did this to yourself." That grin, that self-satisfied grin. "You use our space, mine our asteroids, and pay nothing. We're collecting what's owed." "Very noble, beating an unarmed man near to death," I snapped back. "You're criminals, nothing more. You'll face justice." "Not all of us," replied Khan. The transport landed, and the doors swung open. The pirates donned their respirators and left the transports with their loot. I coughed and wheezed until the doors slammed, and we were back on our way. True to their word, when we were back in orbit, the ship was in one piece, and the crew was waiting for us in the shuttle bay. The bombs around the reactor were disarmed, and the ship was refueled. For the rest of the trip, we were under Navy escort. The atmosphere on the bridge was somber. No one had died, but for half a year we'd been at their mercy. What made it worse was that they'd won. I'd still wonder what I would have preferred. Was it better to live a coward or die pointlessly with pride? The Navy could have killed the pirates. They would have sent a message at least. But instead, I got to return home, a coward. News of the hijacking spread further than I'd imagined. We docked at our original destination. A humble orbital platform above an unremarkable world had turned into a stage worthy of the galaxy. And we were at the center of it. The first ship to successfully be captured by pirates since the early age of space travel had docked, and everyone wanted to see the crew who had endured it. I didn't have family of my own, so the cameras weren't on me. Yukri's girlfriend, now fiancée apparently, reached the security line and wrapped her hips around him and love-pecked him while the whole galaxy watched. A moment that every dramatic retelling of our deal would replicate with excruciating detail. I don't think she or the chicks knew how close to death he'd been. As for the captain, he stayed out of the limelight while the rest of us enjoyed our 15 minutes of fame. The last time I saw him was a few days after we docked. Journalists from a dozen systems wanted interviews, but he'd refused. Story number 2. We Stay Out of That Field, written by AC1308. Ever since Celia was a little girl, she had never been allowed to venture west of the farmhouse. There was a shallow valley there, with the stream they used for water trickling through it and past the farmhouse. But her father had fenced in a large section of the shallow slope on the far side of the valley, right where the most fertile grazing would be, and he never allowed cattle inside. Celia couldn't figure it out, because the grass within the fence grew lush and thick, and she knew the cattle would become fat and fetch a good price at the market. But her parents simply told her that she was to stay away from the stream. If she went to the stream, she was to not cross it. If she crossed it, she was to not go near the fenced field. And if she went near the field, she was to never, ever climb through the fence. As she was a good little girl, mostly, she never crossed the stream, though she waded in it from time to time, catching frogs and totally failing to catch the little silver fish that flickered around her legs and feet. And while she looked across the stream at the slope and the fenced field, and wondered about it, she never went there. It made no sense to her, but her father had laid down the law, and she did as she was told. And so she grew and learned how to run the farm, and even to take a few cows into the market by herself from time to time. But never did her father allow the cattle to graze in that field. Once in a long while, the fence needed repairing, and even that task was performed from outside the field. When she turned 16, she went to her father. "I have a question." He turned to face her, from where he was carving a new handle for the farmhouse door. The old one was beginning to fall apart. "Is it about boys and where babies come from?" She felt her cheeks heat and shook her head quickly. "Mama told me about that last year." He nodded slowly and carved away another sliver of dark wood. "Is it about your letters and numbers?" Again she shook her head. Some small part of her wondered if he were deliberately baiting her. "No, I've learned my letters and know how to read most words. I know how to add numbers and subtract them,
Mama is teaching me how to make them multiply and divide. It's not easy, but that is not the question I wish to ask you."
"Good," he grunted. "I could never learn those things. Adding and subtracting were always enough for me."
She waited while he carved at the wood until she finally realized that he was not going to say any more. "Father, my question—"
"Yes?"
He put down the knife now and faced her.
"Is it about the field across the stream? The one that we do not go into?"
"No, it is—" Belatedly, she realized he wasn't changing the subject anymore. "Yes, that's it, Father. Why don't we go into there? Why do the cattle not graze there? The grass is good as any other part of the valley, or even better." He put the door handle aside and stood up, brushing shavings from his lap. Carefully, he folded the knife away and put it in his pocket.
"Come with me, and I'll show you our family secret."
"We have a family secret?" She hadn't known about this, but that was what secret meant, she figured.
"We do. You could not be told when you were younger." His voice and gaze were unapologetic. "Children will tell secrets to their best friends, and best friends can stop being friends overnight. We had to know that you would not tell this secret to anybody."
They walked away from the farmhouse towards where the cattle were grazing.
"We need one," he told her. "Just one. The poorest of the herd."
"But why?" she asked.
"It'll show the answer to your question," he said. "Drive it towards that field. I will have the gate open when it gets there."
So she did as she was told. The cattle had learned from Carford that humans were bigger and stronger, and they were stupid beasts, and had continued to believe that. The one that she picked was stupider than most, and a little scrawny. It was not hard for her to chivvy it back towards where her father had opened the gate wide, the tall, thick grass inside waving invitingly in the breeze. The young steer that she had picked out trotted eagerly towards the open gate and passed into the open field. Her father stopped her before she could follow it, then instead closed the gate. "Watch," he said quietly. So she watched it. It went a distance into the field, then stopped and began to crop at the thick grass. This was the best fodder it had ever encountered, she could tell. But then it began to move uneasily, taking one step, then another. It stopped again, somehow having wrapped grass around its legs and trapped itself. "What is it doing?" Celia asked. "How stupid is it to do that?" It lowed mournfully, whipping its head around. Celia noted that it wasn't feeding anymore. Instead, it was trying to move its legs and feigning. Then she noticed something else, and the skin all the way down her spine crawled up in terror. The breeze had died, but the grass was still moving. "It wasn't the steer," her father said softly. Frozen to the spot, she saw more and more grass stems wrap around the doomed steer's legs. Any one stem, she imagined, would be weak and easily broken, but 100 or 200, they would bind the poor beasts like the strongest of ropes. And then other stems showed themselves, thicker, still looking normal, but with sharp dart-like tips. Each clump of grass had 2 or 3, and each one that could reach stabbed itself into the steer, driving deeply. She saw the stems darken, and she had a sudden epiphany. More chills chased themselves down her spine. "They're drinking its blood." "Yes," he said, "and that is why you must not go into the field unless there is no other recourse." He moved closer and reached for the fence, barely brushing his hand across the top of the grass stems. "Your mother and I believe that each clump is a separate creature, part of a plant or an animal. They run roots into each other underground, which is where they also store the blood they drain from creatures that venture in here. Come, let them sense you." Greatly daring, she brushed her hand across the grass tips that she had. "You believe that they remember us as friends?" He shrugged. "We put up the fence, and we drive the beasts we will never sell at market into there. They suck the blood, and they use the steers as fertilizer, and do not come past this fence. It may be that they do not think as we do, but I prefer to think that we have an agreement." "Oh." She brushed her hand across the grass stems again, and watched as the scrawny steer sank to its knees, then fell over sideways. "Is it dead?" If it is not, then it will be soon. Let us get back. The door handle needs finishing." As they waded across the stream, Celia glanced back towards the field, where the grass was even now feasting on the sacrificed steer. She had her answers, and too late she discovered that she didn't want them. She took to examining every new growth in case it was the grass that grew in the field. Only when she needed did she cross the stream, and she never went near the field if she could help it. As soon as she found a man to wed, she decided that she would leave this place with its demon grass field and never speak of it again. Her terror of the grass even permeated her sleep. She would have nightmares where she couldn't move, then think that she'd woken to find herself fastened down in the long strands of grass while others moved to puncture her skin and drain her blood. From those she would abruptly wake, sitting upright and frantically searching for even the tiniest blade of grass anywhere near her. One more trip to the market, she decided. Then she would return home, take her meager belongings along with whatever money her parents decided they could spare, and leave the farm forever. Even a life as an itinerant storyteller or dancer was better than living across the stream from an innocent-looking field that could pull down a cow or a horse in moments before they even realized that something was wrong. She walked to the market with the cattle and sold them for a better price than normal. The talk of the marketplace was that bandits had been attacking farms, so fewer farmers were able to bring the cattle in, and thus the price had gone up. Celia wasn't much worried about the reasons. Even a little of the money from the one sale would take her a long way. Everyone talked about the bandits, but not one person in 10 had ever seen one, so she began to trek back towards the farm, already planning what she would leave and what she would take. When she came over the rise and saw the smoke rising from the burning thatch of the farmhouse, she could not believe her eyes. Forgetting her tired legs and sore feet, she broke into a run, hoping that not too much was damaged, and that both her father and mother had gotten out. It took her far too long to wonder why her father was not even now trying to pull it out. That was when she saw the riders, just now urging their horses away from the farmhouse with bulging sacks tied to their saddles. Part of her mind told her that they should look evil, animalistic, demonic. But they merely looked normal, sporting a few more scars than most, but none would draw stares in the marketplace. As she stood irresolute, one of the riders saw her and pointed. A shouted command echoed across the valley. In the next moment, all 4 horsemen were spurring their mounts towards her. Over her shoulder was a sack with potatoes and turnips in it, neither of which her mother had ever had much luck growing. She dropped that and ran. Instinct rather than reason guided her feet, and she had splashed across the stream and was sprinting towards the field before her conscious mind took over. Behind her, she heard the horses fording the stream, then the heavy hoofbeats eating up the distance between them and her. They were coming ever closer, and she got to the gate and opened it, then dashed inside, into the field, where she had been told over and over to never go. Her father's words came back to her. "Unless there is no other recourse." The tall grass stands, reaching up past her waist, whipped against her legs as she ran deeper into the field. She held out her hands, letting the tips of the strands brush her palms. "Know me, know me." All 4 riders thundered their horses into the field. In an instant, they had surrounded her, riding in circles in the field, trapping her between them. She kept her hands brushing across the tips of the strands as she looked up at them, trying to stare them in the eye and keep her attention from what the grass was doing. "Stupid girl," one of the riders spat. "You don't even know how to hide. You should have gone into the forest. Did you think that we couldn't cross a stream?" "Please," she said, looking up at him. "Please, don't hurt me." Her hands brushing the grass. He laughed scornfully, savoring her fear. "Your parents died fast, girl. You won't." So they are dead. The last of her qualms about what she was doing vanished altogether. She moved from foot to foot, as though seeking an escape, ensuring that all 4 riders kept their eyes on her and not on what the grass was doing. The rider who had spoken turned his horse towards her, clearly seeking to capture her, perhaps sling her across his saddle as a trophy. But his horse's legs had already been snared, and the beast stumbled, then fell. Cydia danced about of the way, and then darted between the 2 of the other riders. They shouted and tried to pursue, but then their mounts whinnied in fear as they too found that their legs were entangled. 2 more went down, kicking and squealing in terror. The last rider spurred after her, but she ducked aside. She found that the grass was banding out of her way and not impeding her motion at all, while his horse found it hard going. "Enough of this!" He leapt from the saddle and seized her in one smooth movement, sunlight glinting off the long knife that he pulled from his belt. "You'll do as I say, or death will be long and ugly." "You're already dead." She could see the strands of grass winding around his legs. "You just don't know it." The certainty in her tone gave him pause for half a moment. Then he sneered. "You're alone, girl. Without friends or weapons, a mouse can talk as loud as it pleases, but at the end of the day, it's still a mouse." She looked him in the eye. "A mouse may hide under the paw of a lion." Then she shoved him as hard as she could. In the normal run of events, her attempt would have come to nothing. One step back would have saved him. But he could not move his feet, as sure as though they were mired in quicksand. A startled expression came over his face, and he fell, flailing. The grass closed over him like a funeral shroud. "Witch, what have you done?" One of the other riders had managed to claw himself to his feet, swinging the long blade around, the grass stems parting before his determined assault. "What is this devilry?" She wanted to flee from him, but if he made it to the fence and escaped the field, she would never be safe. So she moved towards him. As before, the grass parted before her, even as it hampered him. She could see the stem stabbing at his legs, to be turned away by thick thigh-length boots that he wore. He swung the blade at her, more to keep her away than to actually strike her. But she ducked aside anyway, moving around behind him. She tried to figure out how to bring him down. He was keeping his legs relatively clear, and if he made it another few strides, he would be free and clear. A simple shove would not do the trick this time. And then something solid nudged at her fingers. She looked down and saw the long knife the other man had threatened her with, supported by strands of grass, offering itself to her. "Yes," she whispered, taking the knife. The blade was good steel and looked wickedly sharp. Moving close in behind him before she could think better to move, she slashed it across the back of his knee. The keen blade sliced through the leather, his skin and the tendons, all at the same time. Blood spurted, and he screamed in pain as he went down onto that knee, his leg giving way beneath him. "Witch!" he screamed again, putting his sword hand onto the ground for one fatal moment to hold himself off the ground. The grass stems crossed over his arm, and she seized the opportunity to leap onto his back. She'd cut the throats of calves and lambs before now, so it was almost second nature to pull his head back and bring the blade across, angling inward one way and then the other. She got the big arteries and then ran down each side of the neck. Bright blood splashed onto the grass and vanished as though it had never been. Panting and shaking, she climbed to her feet and wiped the blood off the knife onto the nearest clump of grass. She then walked out of the field and closed the gate behind her. The horses were no longer thrashing, or, she thought, even breathing any more. All 4 men were down and either dead or near to it. Walking down to the stream, she washed the last of the blood from her hands and the knife, then crossed over and started using the pitchfork to pull the burning thatch from the roof of the farmhouse. When that was done, her father had mixed sod with the straw specifically to make it hard to burn. She went inside to see her parents. The bandit hadn't lied. They were both dead, with wounds that showed that they'd fought to the last. The house had been ransacked, and everything that could possibly be of value, which was probably what had been in the sacks tied to the saddles of the horses. She decided that she would go back across the stream and reclaim it later. For now, she had 2 graves to dig. Some days later, Derek, the farmer from further down the valley, showed up with his son. "You're all alone now," Derek said bluntly. "My older boy will be taking over my farm when the time comes, but you and Dallas each like each other well enough. Do you think that you could help you out here and see what happens?" Dallas was of age with her, and he and she had tested out some of what Mama had told her the year before. She wasn't averse to spending more time with him, if it came to that. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was good enough. "Yes," she said. "I'll tell you in a 6 months if you'll be staying." "Fair," Derek said. "You be a good boy now, and do what Celia says." Taking his hat off and walking staff, he went outside, then peered up at the repair job that she'd been doing on the thatch. "Mayhap I could bring the others over to help fix this." "With Dallas handing me a hand, I should have it done before the rain comes," Celia told him. Having a group of people around the farmhouse, wandering across the stream and asking awkward questions about the field, was not what she wanted. "You say so?" He put his hat back on his head. "You didn't see which way the bandits went after leaving here, did you? They haven't been seen." "Oh, I hid," she assured him. "Perhaps they left the district." "Most like," he agreed. "Be a good now, Delos." "I will, father." Celia watched the older man stump away down the road. When he'd gone, she turned to Delos. "You'll be sleeping in the kitchen until I say otherwise." "Aye," he agreed. "And you'll be feeding the chickens. I'll show you where we store the feed away from the rats." "Aye." "And one more thing," she pointed across the stream. "We stay out of that field." End of story. Story number 3. Good neighbors are hard to come by. Written by Al Sporno. Today, class, we will be going over the history of the human-Ula relations and the incidents leading up to the Second Krull War. Many hatchlings may be familiar with the movie on the subject, but let's put that melodrama aside. Here we will discuss the real history. Sub-Professor Jujan looked out to his new batch of hatchlings, almost expecting the bored expressions of prior years as a matter of course. Instead, he saw wide-eyed Ula children all riveted to the edges of their seats. I almost forgot about how popular that winter release really was. That big actor, what was his name? Anyways, I suppose they all got excited because of the Godspeed Damned movie. John would take the student's interest however he could get it, though, and he sighed contentedly, moving around some static images on his display panel, focusing on the one fearsome-looking individual. "This is High Commander Ulajan." That brought out a flare of extra interest from the students. She was, of course, the architect of the original agreement, and the reason we founded Salvation, and why our capital city is named Ulaja. That was her who brokered the treaty and, "Pack it up, everything we can," the High Commander ordered, her voice soft and low, barely audible over the fearsome tropical cyclone roaring outside. "I've had it with this egg-sucking dump." As if punctuating a statement, one of the outlying temporary structures blew off of its flimsy foundations, all caught in high definition by a ship's video monitors. Native vegetation covered a large part of the ship's exterior, and soon camera footage might be blocked, or impossible to see through the burning hot rain. Fortunately, all the civilians had already been loaded back onto their transports, or casualties would have already mounted up. Beside her, Captain Canis scratched his scales absently. "Well, it's not the first time the astronomers screwed up, I suppose. Pity it had to be our expedition that got this arse end of it, though." The planet selected by Command's Astronomy Division had been thoroughly analyzed for traces of a suitable life and was deemed well within the zone of habitability. With the desperation of a final Krull invasion, there had been no time to send the usual probes to confirm everything ahead of time. Several colonization experts had been sent out on different courses to far-flung, potentially habitable worlds, to save most of the Ula from extinction at the hands of the Krull Armada. And even in the best of times, the division had made errors. It was merely a pity that this one was particularly bad. "We haven't even officially named it yet," High Commander Ulijan said. "But it's far too hot for comfort, barely survivable. And then add to it those egg-sucking storms and the rain that burns the scales and—"
"I heard some people calling it paradise, though I am pretty sure that was a bit of sarcasm."
Canis laughed and signaled his agreement, adjusting the personal cooler's air closer to his face. Even the ship's interior cooling system had a hard time with the native climate.
"How astronomers have picked up much more promising world just 5 light-years away. I'm not sure how the division missed it, but we have the fuel, barely. We could try there."
Ulijan waved a hand distractedly. "Yes, we'll try that. A pity about the supply caches, though. I suppose that we could come back for them if they're really necessary." Automated ships had been able to hyper in faster than the crewed transports, which were barely able to manage 10C. So, the division had sent a number to the planet and had them auto-land in various locations around the planet to aid the colonization effort. They, however, did not have the fuel to lift off again, and it would take many trips to bring even an appreciable fraction of those supplies with them. Trips that did not have fuel for. "That was the only reason that I was trying so hard to make it work on this excrement-filled waste of a planet. But Canis is right. This is never going to work long-term. If there is anything we really need, we can come back for it. 1 or 2 small trips might be workable with our fuel reserves." With that, Ulijan passed along the orders, and the transports abandoned the ruined camp, flying through the eye of the storm as it passed overhead. Most of the colonists breathed a sigh of relief. Paradise was anything but. The mechanics of the hyperdrive made less relative mechanics, and only the computers could really unwind it in any reasonable amount of time. But after a quarter of a year in hyper, and about half of the one in real time, the colonization fleet entered the neighboring star system. Certainly, that beat the many years spent in cryo when the ships hypered in this area of space to begin with, but it was still long. The High Commander grinned as soon as the hyper-translation had finished. Astro readings were far more favorable in the system. The 5th planet was far colder than Paradise had been, and much more to the liking of Ula in general. In fact, in better days, this world might have been considered a resort, a place for older Ula to retire and live out their days in peace and tranquility. Captain Canis interrupted her.
"High Commander, I am reading a fleet of ships in system, in high orbit over that target world."
"What?" she said. She had been so fixated on the climate readings that she had not looked at the detection grid. "Krull?" Fear traveled down her spine. If the enemy had reached the system, all was lost.
"No, definitely not. The readings are unlike any others I've seen. The tech level is, it's kind of low, to be honest. The Krull would never be caught dead flying anything like this. But I am detecting drive emissions similar to ours. They have hyper capability, but their power levels, something is wrong."
"You mean besides them being camped out around our planet? I don't have to remind you, Captain, there is no other potential habitable worlds within range and—" Her radio comm pinged. The mysterious fleet was trying to contact her, but the frequencies were all wrong. A data pulse came through anyway, but the computer could make no sense of it. Everything was gibberish. "Get linguistics on this right away. In the meantime, park the fleet here, and do not make any sudden moves. We don't need to fight right now."
"Yes, High Commander,"
Canis answered. Not long after, linguistics suggested acknowledging the transmission with a radio transmission of their own, using universal elements to try and at least imply peaceful intent. The colonization fleet was armed, in theory, but they could not afford to lose any ulna or material. Everything was critical now, especially with the loss of the supply caches. It had taken the better part of a month for the linguistics department, working in tandem with several mathematicians and cultural experts, to crack the data packet the mysterious aliens had sent over. But once they had, they found the software equivalent of a full dictionary of the aliens' language. some instructions on how to contact them, and a name for the creature. Humans. It also explained why they were here. After that, it was relatively a simple matter for the programmers to work out an automated translation matrix. And so, the human High Commander, his rank appeared to be Admiral in their language, face filled her display.
"We were beginning to worry communication would not be possible,"
the human said. There was some lag, but the translation matrix appeared to be working well enough. It is not easy. I am pleased that we were able to manage. It has been many thousands of years since we made contact with another race. Religion was calm, but wary. The last first contact had been with the Krull, and that had instantly become a violent affair. There was no reasoning with the Krull. Krull did not care to communicate in any fashion that indicated a desire for dialogue. They merely hounded other races across the stars and stole whatever was left behind. That these humans had been patient and eager to communicate suggested that this might go off a little better.
"I see,"
the human High Commander began.
"Well, I imagine you got our message."
"We did," Ulijan said. "And as it so happens, I may have a proposal that could work for both of us." The human commander nodded his head, which Ulijan took to be a signal to continue. "We just came from a world, one we called Paradise. It was kind of a joke."
"A joke?"
The human commander seemed curious. "Yes," Ulijan said. "That egg-sucking world was about as inhospitable for us as you can imagine. Technically, it was barely habitable. But for us, it was practically a death world, far too warm." The human nodded more. Perhaps that means agreement more than to continue. But the cultural experts would analyze the conversation later for things a High Commander would not necessarily pick up on the first time around. The human explained,
"Well, this world here is a death world for us, far too cold, barely habitable, and the nickname we gave it was Dante's Icebox."
Religion paused. A cultural expert suggested that this was probably some cultural reference.
The human continued, "But from the readings you sent of where you just came from, that would be a paradise for us."
"Yes, we thought as much," Religion said. "Which leads me to my proposal. I suggest a trade. Your ships are in low on fuel and running in low power mode. You could probably adapt our fuel to work with your powertrain, from what our engineers can tell. And while we do not have a lot ourselves, we could give you just barely enough for your people to make it there. We could, then, basically just trade worlds. This one is better for us. That one is better for you." Data from the humans during the month of translation struggle indicated that the human fleet had been left to its own system under bad circumstances. Some kind of environmental catastrophe or another, though the cultural experts had not been able to fully grasp the details, and did not even have enough fuel to budget to hop to another nearby system. They were trapped here, and would probably die here without help. Their drives were less efficient and less advanced, and the ship's engineers considered it a minor miracle that these aliens had even made the journey here successfully, without the ships breaking apart under the strain.
"Our astronomers have confirmed your observations, and we'd be very much obliged if you could help us with the fuel, but, we have another problem. Our supply ships landed here, and we can't refuel them."
Religion scratched the scales in thought for a moment. Then again, she needed this world, and they needed Paradise. It makes sense, even if the law technically prohibits tech transfer. Well, the governing council probably doesn't exist anymore anyway, and I was invested with fuel authority. Well, as it so happens, we had a similar problem. We had intended to go back to recover our own supplies in time, but we did not have the fuel to lift it off from orbit again. We were going to have to raid it periodically in case there was something critical." Religion paused. The human regarded her for a moment and then cut the audio, talking to a number of other humans outside the video frame. Audio picked back up a moment later.
"We could trade those too. We can give you the locations of all of our supply drops, and you can give us locations of yours. It's not one for one, I'm sure, but this could help us both."
Religion considered this, then added a stipulation. "Additionally, we can agree that if either of us is critical need of our item, we'll both help each other out. If there is anything unforeseen that either people has to deal with when settling their world."
"That sounds great to us," the human said. "More than fair. More than we could ever ask for in our present circumstances."
She signaled her agreement, then forgot humans probably did not understand the gesture any more than she knew their body language. We agree in principle. I'm sure there are small things to be worked out by our respective crews, but I suppose it is fortunate that we both landed in these respective systems at nearly the same time. The humans had been orbiting this world since abandoning their colonies on the surface 5 local years prior, but that was still pretty close in cosmic terms. Their people still seemed to believe in deities, and it was almost enough for religion to consider it herself. The human smiled. It looked like her species' fighting expression, but the cultural experts assured her that it was a friendly gesture with them.
We look forward to it, High Commander. Thank you so much for your help. We were probably doomed without you. We'll never forget what you did for us here.
The agreement turned out to be very fortuitous for both races, John explained. The humans indeed found paradise to be more to the name than we did. For them, it was every bit of the resort world, ideally suited for their species, as salvation is for us. Humans, you see, are a species that prefers much warmer climates. And for them, while the cyclones present on Paradise were a problem, they were no worse for humans than the avalanches are for us on Salvation. Now, as you can see in your biological section, humans live somewhat longer lives than Ula do. We do not have full understanding of human history, mind you, as our relations are relatively few and far between. We live on our world, and they in theirs, and there is little need to bother one another. But it seems that they conducted some gene engineering upon themselves to do that. Humans are tinkerers, you see, always messing with things. They learned from our technology and soon matched us, but we learned from theirs. Their supply ships were crude in many ways, but also quite clever, and the transfer benefited us almost as much as it benefited them. A boy in the back of the row of the class tapped his desk with fingered claws. Yes, Edget. When are you going to get to the good part? The part about I'm going to get to that. Patience, hatchling. Many generations later, alarms sounded in the orbital monitoring station command deck. High Commander Ystir swore as missiles shot out from the Krull battleship. 2 other stations had already been destroyed, but with their deaths, they had at least bought time for Ystir to marshal his forces. Few, though, they were. Nobody had seriously thought the Krull would ever find them, or even if they had been able to determine their course, thought to spend all the years in cryo just to get here. And failing all of that, being able to figure out that the fleet would go to another nearby system entirely. Ystir said a silent prayer to the old gods, hoping that the Krull hadn't also bothered the humans on Paradise. Contact with them was sporadic at best. Every few years a human trade vessel might come and go. Ula ships never bothered. Trade was not nearly necessary. Both systems were rich in raw materials, and the Ula were relatively pleased with the standard of living. Humans liked to make the journey on occasion, but even they expressed profits were marginal on such trips in recent memory. Fuel costs for hyper-travel were quite large. Still, relations with them had always been friendly, if rare. No Ula would want to lead the merciless Krull to another race of innocence. For the moment, though, there was work to be done, and no time to spend mourning the possibilities that their neighbors might have to contend with the same forces. Point-defense lasers targeted the Krull missiles and annihilated the first wave. Ystir barked orders at his crew, sending the wave of nuclear torpedoes out to meet the enemy fleet. From the hyperpoint, the Krull had spread out across the outer system, and were closing in on the meager defense of Salvation itself. There were not enough Ula ships to stop them, though with the monitoring stations, they might buy enough time for another colonization fleet to escape in an ancient, 1,000-year-old transport still orbiting Salvation. A few small cruiser-class warships gathered on the fringes of Ystir's monitoring zone and added their own torpedoes to the fray. The Krull battleship was badly mauled and shut down its drives, coasting on a ballistic trajectory. Ystir did not celebrate. The salvo had drained his missile inventory by a third, and additional forces were already speeding towards him.
Do not waste any more ammunition on this disabled war vessel,
Ystir called out on the cruisers.
Target the next wave.
It did not take long for much larger force to enter the zone of responsibility. One of these cruisers was practically vaporized by the next exchange of fire, for only a minor damage on one Krull battleship. An enemy warhead detonated close to his station, and decompression alarms sounded, hatches automatically slamming shut. If the station was lost, the cruisers would not be able to saturate the Krull point defense by themselves. All would be lost. Peripheries open to space. We didn't lose any launches, but the point defense lost several laser clusters, his sub-commander said fearfully. We can't take another hit like that. Yister launched a desperate salvo, burning through almost all of his remaining missile reserves. One Krull battleship exploded violently to the cheering Ular voices, but Yister felt bile coming up in his second stomach. I don't have enough ammunition necessary to do that again. If they come now, I can't stop them. Still, the sudden saturation salvo seemed to have given the Krull commander momentary pause. His surviving battleship and its screening elements altered course and stayed just outside of the power torpedo range, probing the station's defenses. One of his sister stations fell, his zone of responsibility increasing accordingly. Little battles like this were occurring all around Salvation, and soon the Krull would be able to bombard the planet without the interference from orbital station defenses. Or worse, they'd be able to get to the colony ships. Command had made it clear, if the Krull tried to bombard the planet and get the colony ships at the same time, the colony ships must survive. They had priority. They would flee to another world and continue to chase across the stars. The thought made Yister cringe. His nestlings were down there. Hypertranslation, sir. Large force incoming. How many battleships? Yister wondered, hope living his voice. This is the end. Not just for me. Not even just my family. But possibly our entire race. They aren't Krull, High Commander. What? They're human! Krull, Commander! A booming voice said over the hypercom. You will heave to and shut down all drives immediately. All weapons fire will cease, pending negotiated surrender. Yister was floored. More human ships made translation. Some of them were larger than even the Krull super dreadnought. And there are more of them than eggs in the Emperor's harem. God's hell! Why? The Krull were, at first, rather unimpressed, in typical Krull fashion. But the first battleships to attempt to fire after the proclamation was promptly vaporized by hundreds of nuclear torpedoes. Still, more human ships made translation into the system. The human armada had grown to stupendously large. It would have been enough to give even the old Krull home fleet pause. Some Krull ships attempted to flee back into hyperbands, but the moment a drive would spin up, the human torpedoes, far faster than our own, Yister noted, sought out the offending ship and reduced it to scrap. In the end, Krull aggressiveness and cultural disdain for submission of any kind won out, and soon the entire Krull armada was so much floating space junk. Yister immediately called the human commander over the hypercom. We are relieved beyond measure that you helped us out, but why? His curiosity was intense. Relations with humanity had always been distant. They were neighbors, of course, but both peoples kept to themselves mostly. Certainly, he never expected them to come in guns blazing like this. The human smiled. We had an agreement with your first High Commander, Ulajan, she said, and I quote, additionally, we can agree that if either has a critical lead, we'll both help each other out. And you see, we take that pretty seriously. Seems like the Krull invasion is pretty critical. Yister felt hope for the first time since the Krull scouts had first been sighted. How did you know? The Krull scouts came upon our world first, looking for you, I presume. They did not enjoy their visit, but I figure they probably came to the same conclusion that your colonists did all those years ago, said the human. We'd figured we'd better check in on you, just in case. It seemed our caution was warranted. But so many ships. You must be unprotected now, Yister protested. What if they come for your world? Oh, this, the human gestured around him. This is just a recon force. You should see our battle fleet. Yister had nothing to say to that, but he felt a twinge of fear. What? If the humans decided to conquer salvation, it would be easy enough for them, even if it was only a fleet that they possessed. The human smiled in his manner, almost as if reading Ula Commander's thoughts. Don't worry. You've been great neighbors over the centuries, High Commander, and we wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for the help you gave us in the beginning. We're always in your debt. Without you, our entire species might have gone extinct. You know, we even kept your name on our world. Paradise. The High Commander blinked in silence. The crew of station just watched in shock, expecting to wake up and find that this was all some kind of sleeping trance. Yeah, I know. We didn't come over much, the human said, his eyes kindly somehow. We never had a lot of dealings, your people and mine. We mostly stay in our systems, you mostly stay in yours. But we never forgot the kindness you showed us in our time of need. And you've always been good neighbors. We appreciate that more than you knew, perhaps. Certainly, we weren't going to let someone stomp you like this. The human grinned and continued, and we'd hate to trade a good neighbor for those Krull arseholes. You know, we tried talking to their scouts, even used your language database that you gave us way back when, and the only thing they sent back was a picture of their genitals. Those guys are really messed up at the head. Then you heard us here. We offered them the chance to live and, well, we gestured expansively to the in-system wreckage. Yesta sighed. We've never encountered anyone who could make peace with them. Then again, we've never encountered anyone who could so easily best them in war, either. The human commander made strange noises, the translation computer signaling that as it was laughing. The gesture and vocalizations humans made when they were amused. That's pretty hilarious. Well, if they really think that they're all that, maybe we should go and pay them a visit. Got the coordinates of their homeworld. Yesta's crest displayed in amusement, and he huffed with pleasure at the joke, feeling the fear of the tension leave him finally. It hit him then. His nestlings were safe. His home was safe. Everything was going to be all right. He'd been prepared to sacrifice his life, the lives of all the defenders, and most of his family, in the slim hope that maybe a colony ship or two could escape. And now, everything was going to be okay. The human's expression shifted, and he stared at Yesta as if patiently waiting for some kind of response. Wait! The crazy egg layer is serious. I'll need to call command.
So, what happened after that, teacher? Did the humans go to the Krull homeworld?
Richard asked. The other students watched it on for more, practically hanging on every word. The school chimes sounded, and the class ended. I am guessing the movie didn't cover that part, or you would all know the answer to that already, John said amused. We'll go over the other battles of the Second Krull War tomorrow, but suffice to say that the Krull never bothered us again. Bridget stopped at his desk on the way out. The child showed a very human-like curiosity at times, and John felt himself softening a little.
Teacher, did High Commander Ulajan know that the humans would help us with the Krull? Is that why she phrased the agreement that way?
The old teacher signaled confusion. Nobody knows, little hatchling. Of course, the official government position is that she knew what she was doing, though how she could have foreseen what the humans would become, nobody knows. Historians are a little more divided on that point, but the more I study their culture, the more I think the humans probably would have come to our aid anyway. They have a saying, good neighbors are hard to come by. End of story. Story number 4. The Colony, written by X. Weiler. It has to be a colony. It has to. The surveyor stared at the scanner. The captain shook his head with disbelief.
But it's too big. Even most conservative models estimate 15 million people.
He pointed at a figure on his datapad. It has to be. Look, the biosphere is much too immature to support such complex life. The surveyor pointed at another of his displays. Most of the planet is covered with some barely anything better than moss and lichen, probably because it's being choked by the huge amounts of heavy metals permeating the soil.
But who in their right mind would put a colony on a planet like this, let alone one this big? The captain objected.
The surveyor shrugged. I don't know, but they've gone through a lot of trouble to live here. He pulled up another image, this time of a visual telescope. See all of these structures dotted around the city, glass-covered farms to keep their plants from being contaminated with all of these heavy metals from airborne dust. He turned to look at the captain. Just about the only thing this place has going for it is the oxygen atmosphere, and even that is going to chronically poison you if the dust is fine enough.
That's insane. Within just the last 100 lights we surveyed, there were 5 planets that would make better colonies. A stone's throw from here. Why this?
The surveyor turned back to his display. We could ask them, make first contact. He paused. My team has located at least 2 sites that we have interstellar-level communication dishes. With their general level of technology, it's virtually certain that they've already seen us. The surveyor summoned an image of a group of white ovals with few very small rectangles next to them on the screen.
Do you know where they are pointed?
My team thinks that the big ones are aimed at the yellow star 8.2 lights away, a binary with loose ternary 9.8 lights away, and a red star 12.3 lights away. An unusually close grouping of colonies. Comms is scanning for hyperwave signals of those stars. No hit yet.
The captain straightened himself and stroked his whiskers on his face. First contact would greatly alter their mission profile, but it was part of his mandate as a Council Survey ship captain. It would also be his first, and a feather in the survey captain's hat. He was supposed to contact only spacefaring species. Pre-civilizations were the purview of specialist uplift teams, but these people clearly passed the test, since there was no way that they could have originated on this hellhole of a rock. He weighed in all options and finally sighed with his decision. All right, pick a site and have the comms start broadcasting the standard protocol and language primers. He glanced at the bridge chronometer. Give me a full summary of your findings in the next decicycle. Captain, the comms officer called from his station. We're receiving a signal on radio, a repeating sequence of prime-numbered pulses. The captain hurried over to his station and examined the readout in front of the operator. Radio? What in the devil are they doing? The comm shook his head. I don't know. I've initiated a radio frequency sweep, and they're sending the same signal on at least 8 channels, widely spread across the radio spectrum. He regarded his instruments for a moment. They're clearly trying to get our attention, but the only reason we noticed was that our synthetic aperture ground radar happens to be on almost harmonic of one of the basebands, and the computer notified me of the interference. The captain stared at the readouts with an exasperated look. I don't understand. It's like they haven't heard us, but this close to a hyperwave broadcast should be unmistakable. The comms officer tapped the screen. A bit more blips started appearing on the spectrum analyzer. Maybe they haven't heard us. The computer is detecting lots of signals everywhere on the radio bands, but not a blip on hyperwave. He paused for a moment to think. We're not in the signal path of those big dishes anymore, but I'll bet you $1,000,000 they're broadcasting in radio. The captain looked incredulous. Interstellar radio? Surely you're joking. The target stars are just close enough for that to be barely feasible. Maybe that's why they're so close. You'll have a 10-year time lag on your broadcast, though. We'll never pick up a return signal. Our radio receivers aren't sensitive enough. He pulled up a photo of the dishes from the survey library and ran his cursor across one of the dishes in measuring mode. You'll need one of those. I guess the survey didn't measure them, or didn't understand the implication. Each is 140 paces across. Total overkill for hyperwave, but totally necessary for radio. The captain whistled. They're insane. Why would they do that? The comms officer shrugged. I don't know, but I think we should try resending the primers with radio. I'll need a couple of millicycles to alter the message to correct for radio communication instead of hyperwave. The captain nodded. Okay, do it. The captain sulked glumly, sitting in his station on the bridge. He haphazardly browsed the wealth of information all of his departments were producing. They'd been in orbit for 12 local days, and his excitement at the first contact had long since turned into boredom. He was supervising as their captain, but he himself had no direct use for all the data that they were gathering. Most of it had been seen already anyway, and they were just refining what they had already knew. What they knew was maddeningly incongruous. He had tried to solve the puzzle these people presented, but every angle he tried to think of resulted in contradictions. He'd given up and now could only wait and see if the aliens would manage to decode the instructions in the primer for true contact. They had tried, both sides, to use more primitive methods while they waited. For their own part, they had tried to snoop on the aliens' radio broadcast network, but all the signals were digital. Without knowing the encodings, they were just a binary noise. Many seemed very sophisticated, often extremely low-power spread spectrum signals that frustratingly danced at the edge of their radio receiver's noise floor. Others, even the high-powered broadcast links, used heavily compressed data to pack as much into a crowded radio channels as they could. The aliens, on the other hand, had managed limited success. The fruits of that were playing quietly in the background on the bridge. Alien music, quite catchy at times, but very weird. Somebody on the planet had connected the analog amplitude modulator carrier onto one of the communication dishes and pointed it at the ship. Whenever their orbit moved them out of the sight of the dish, another dish on the other side of 8 communication stations on the planet took over. They had recorded almost 2 days of music by now, almost uninterrupted. There had been a few repeats, but it had been mostly unique pieces, usually 1 to 3 millicycles in length, with a few seconds of silence between. Another signal from the planet that they had managed to decipher had contained several crude images encoded as Series 10,201 2-level pulses each. Somebody at comms had realized that it was a squared prime and once laid out in rows and columns of 101. The pulses revealed a simple, low-resolution line drawing of, presumably, the aliens. Bipedal, upright, 2 lower limbs, 2 upper limbs, with 5 manipulators in each, and a round bulb on the top of the body, with 5 possible orifices. Head? There were also abstract symbols which were open to interpretation, and no 2 crewmen would agree on what they represented. The captain had allowed comms to return the favor, and one lucky artist on board probably got themselves immortalized in Alien Gallery as a dotted bit drawing, as had the comms officer's entire collection of Flang and Metawub music. Deities helped the people on the planet. But apart from the minor cultural exchange, the aliens on the planet were still as much of a mystery as they had been when the survey ship had arrived. Their technology, that they could see, seemed very sophisticated. The problem was that they couldn't see. The aliens had hardly any space presence, yet they were very clearly interstellar. In orbit around the planet were just 16 satellites in various orbits. There was a similar lack of space infrastructure on the ground. Not a single starport was evident on the planet. A colony this big should be a major travel destination, yet there was no evidence of any such traffic. On the ground, a huge amount of effort had been spent making this borderline planet habitable. Toxic amount of heavy metal choked the planet's biosphere, and everything grown had to remain encased in artificially kept environments. Even much of the cities themselves were enclosed in glass, with all of the air presumably filtered to keep the toxic dust from contaminating everything. All this effort spent for no apparent reason. To put 50 million colonists on a planet that hardly seemed worth the effort, especially when better planets were just a couple dozen lights away, a few days' travel. The aliens' communications networks that they could trace out from the orbit were very complex. Huge amounts of data flowed everywhere, and the modulations and encodings were as advanced as any they had seen. But they were all radio, and not one beep of hyperwave transmission anywhere. Not even the huge communication dishes that had kept unwaveringly pointed at the same 3-star systems since the day the surveyors arrived. Each alone a marvel of engineering, constantly broadcasting a tremendous power and bit rates through a dozen lights of interstellar void. There were some of the most advanced radio transmitters the comms department had ever seen. But they were radio. It would take a decade for the signal to even reach its destination. The distance, even just a moderate hyperwave caster could bridge in mere decicycles, let alone one that would broadcast with as much power as his antenna did. None of this made any sense, and these contradictions were everywhere the surveyors looked. The captain shook his head as he read yet another report. His chronic metaphorical headache had almost developed into a physical one by now. "Captain!" There was a loud cry from the comm station, we're receiving a basic link-up protocol handshake signal from the planet. The captain perked up, and a few moments later, as the comms officer continued, Interlang message. They are accepting the Primer's invitation for discourse and wish to initiate video meeting at our earliest convenience. The captain sat straight up in his chair and pondered for a few moments. Well then, people, we may finally have some answers to our mysteries. He looked over each of his officers. Unless there are objections, we accept, and I shall receive their representative in 1 decicycle. He waited to see if anyone would voice their concerns, and then looked at the comms when no one did. Send the reply. The captain nervously placed the quiet bridge. He wished that he had, at the same time, set both more time and less time to prepare for the meeting. The ship's chronometer ticked down microcycles. The captain tugged at the jacket of his formal uniform one more time. Comms, 1,100 micros, Captain. The link-up is stable. We are ready to broadcast. The captain squared his shoulders and puffed himself up, trying to look at least like how he ought to feel as the authority and representative of the Galactic Council. 500 micros. He closed his eyes and ran through the different scenarios over in his mind one more time. 200. We're receiving ready acknowledgement. The captain turned to face the view screen. Activate. There was a moment of a flicker of the two-way video and audio link stabilized. An alien being appeared on the screen, broadly similar in layout to most of the species present on the bridge. He, she, it appeared to have smooth, fairly light skin, no covering, except for a mass of some kind of hairs on its head. Color was impossible to judge on the video with grayscale. Intensity only, both to save bandwidth and to simplify the image generation, as different species had different color ranges and primaries. The round bulb at the top of the creature's torso in the drawing that they had received was, indeed, the head. The oval orifice on the midline appeared to be visual organs, and the large one in the bottom fit the characteristics of a mouth. In the middle of the face was a triangular protrusion. The alien was wearing a plain jacket of dark cloth, with folded cloth lips lining the cut around its neck. Underneath was a light-colored shirt with tighter folds right up the creature's neck. The dark strap of cloth hung down from its neck. Suddenly, the captain felt rather overdressed in his gaudy blue dress jacket and fanciful gold filigree lining, each of a multitude of cuts. He studied the alien measuredly, gauging how long he should wait until he started speaking. He misjudged it, and just as he was about to, the alien started first. The mouth on the alien opened, revealing 2 lines of white teeth. The alien's speech was rhythmic and flowing, relatively smooth and low on the frequency register. Words melded into each other with little pause or distinction. It was similar, although flatter and more regular, to what they had heard accompanied in some of the alien music. Interlang translations appeared next to the video image. We, people, greeting extended due to occasion of arrival of you specific at Colony Eden, part of the Human Commonwealth. I, female, am administrator with Interlang was extremely stilted, but then it wasn't meant for great literature. It was designed for ease of teaching and unambiguity. Interlang wasn't a language you could speak. Instead, it encoded concepts symbolically, unambiguously, one idea per one symbolic entry. These symbols were not words that you could not splice, play or pun with them. They were atomic indexes of the language's symbolic dictionary, and the way they combined was thoroughly structured without exceptions. The captain made note that the proper nouns came up as phonetics. Therefore the computer had never heard of them before, nor had the aliens translated them into Interlang concepts, so the meaning they had, if any, was not part of the Interlang dictionary. He responded in his most authoritative voice that he could muster, even though the alien undoubtedly would not notice the nuances. "I am Captain." As he spoke, the Interlang appeared on the screen so that he could make sure the translator was translating correctly. "I, male, am Captain rank. Captain job of survey ship Fastidious, representative of the Galactic Council, performing on their previous noun behalf, survey special task of this spatial galactic arm." The captain continued, "We are on a peaceful mission, and we wish to extend to you the friendship of the Galactic Council and open formal relations with your species." The administrator read the translations on her screen and nodded. We appreciate your peaceful intentions. However, we did not detect your arrival to our planet. How do you travel? The captain was taken aback by the question. There had been nothing special about their method of travel. If anything, the powerful hyperdrive in the survey ship would make them much more easy to see across many lights. We travel normally using our hyperdrive. Our intentions are open. We have no active stealth systems. The administrator looked carefully at the interlang translation. She then looked at someone to the side, outside the camera's view. There was a short conversation, but the audio was muted and no translations appeared. She turned back to the camera. I'm sorry. I do not understand. We could not translate the concept for interlang symbols, travel, hyperspatial, and hyperdrive. That was unusual, the captain thought. But sometimes the more specialized parts in interlang primer weren't clear to some species or another. He glanced over at the system specialist, who gave an all okay sign, indicating that their system was working fine. How did your species travel to found this colony? Maybe he could figure out which interlang word the aliens had mapped to the concept of space travel. We traveled real space here from Sol. Ah, they had simply taken the normal space travel verb to use for all travel. We traveled real space as normal as well. Her look changed, but to what the captain could not be sure. She looked again to the side and subtly shook her head. Her hand did a small turning gesture in the air. Presumably, she was listening to someone from off-camera. After a moment, she turned back, but none of our observatories could see your engine exhaust plume. Now, it was the captain's turn to look confused. Everybody in the galactic community used gravitic thrusters that gripped the very fabric of space-time. They had no visible exhaust, and gravitics were a prerequisite for hyperdrive and interstellar travel. He turned to look at his chief engineer and noticed that he had turned unusually yellow. He turned to look at the system specialist next. He gave the captain a non-committal shrug. But then his thoughts must have caught up with the engineers, and he also, suddenly, looked shaken up. Before the captain could ask, the chief engineer walked to stand beside the captain's chair, right in view of the camera. He didn't address the captain, but instead spoke towards the view screen. Can you describe your colony ship for us? The captain was annoyed that this situation had started to slip away from his control, but he gave a quick gesture towards the comm station to signal that they should allow the translator to translate him as well. After a moment, his question appeared in the message box in interlang. I can show you a picture of it. The administrator nodded off camera. A few moments later, the view changed to a photograph of a vessel of some sort in front of a cloudy planet. The vessel was long, a spindly one, with a large round circular bulge in the middle, a third of the way from the rear. Behind the bulge was a cluster of 6 long cylinders that each ended in an enormous lattice framework in the shape of a bell. Along the cylinders were bands of increasing intervals towards the back end. Each also had gigantic radiators strutting directly out, black and shiny. In front of the bulge were a series of staggered containers radially attached around the thin spine, until finally, at the very most tip, was a white glistening chunk of something that looked like ice. The captain was speechless. He had never seen a vessel like this, ever, and as a member of the Galactic Survey, he had seen vessels from all corners of the galaxy. The alien's voice came, and more interlang appeared. This is the Ark Royale. She is 14 kilometers long and carried 5,000 frozen and 10 million genetic colonists. 16 kilopaces, that can't... The captain didn't know what to think anymore. Had the ship been here now, it would have dwarfed their survey ship like it would dwarf a millibug. More than 100 of them could have been lined up end to end, a beam of it. The implications weren't lost to the engineer, and if he hadn't been yellow already, he would be now. Captain... He spoke hesitantly. That ship, that thing is a magnetic acceleration fusion torch. It must be. The captain turned to him and spread his arms in a gesture of, I don't know. They flew here slower than light, Captain. Now, it was the captain's turn to turn yellow. Suddenly, it all made sense. Every last bit of it. No hyperwave, no space traffic. Why here? Because... it was probably the only planet they knew of and only place that they could be. 5,000 colonists going towards an unknown planet with oxygen atmosphere. No hope of return or rescue. It was live here or die. And they did.
Very few species go out into the universe on their own, but he had never heard of a race leave their system before inventing the hyperdrive, let alone spread out to the stars. The energies required to do so in a relativistic universe were almost insurmountable. Even today, building that colossus of a ship that had brought them here could bankrupt any one of the planetary economies in the galactic community. And yet, they did build it, more than once. There were at least 2 other colonies around the stars their interstellar radios pointed towards. What has been unleashed onto the universe? End of story. Story number 5. The Lost King, written by Dr. Blackjack21. The meeting was going poorly. Things were threatening to unwind as the council destabilized into panic and shouting. The demon horde was here. It was the end of all things. Princess Thalia felt herself being swept up in the tide of despair that was threatening to overcome the last gathering of elves and men. But her role was to provide an aura of quiet serenity wherever she went, and if that was all she had to offer in these dark times, she would do so now. Unfortunately, her brother, the King of the Elves, didn't share her sense of duty. Amidst all the shouting, he leaned over the 2 of his closest advisors and whispered low enough that Thalia herself was likely the only one to hear them. "Gather your most trusted warriors. This alliance is over. We'll retreat behind our walls to enjoy what time we have left, while we wait for the end." His words drove a knife into Thalia's heart. She watched as he, the noble King of Elves, snuck out of the War Council, leaving everyone else to face their fates. For but a moment, her serene smile faltered as her eyes threatened to overflow with unwanted tears. But that was when she caught his eyes for the first time. At the other side of the room, a human general met her gaze. He was far too young for the role that had been thrust upon his shoulders, more by vacancy and necessity than experience. But his gaze held a steady resolve that helped Thalia find her serenity once more. She smiled and nodded her gratitude to the man who probably had no idea what he'd just done for her. He grinned toothily at her, and she noticed a wicked gleam in his eyes. Thalia continued to watch as he took a deep breath and bellowed over the crowd, drawing everyone's attention as he did so. "Lords, ladies, and fellow generals, all I'm hearing are words of lost and defeated. This is the doom of our times. The end is here. Let us run and hide, buying what little time we may." Thalia wondered if maybe this man had noticed her brother's disgraceful acts and was about to level accusations to remove the blame of the fate of this war from his own shoulders. The princess couldn't even blame him. If this was how he wanted to spend his last days, so be it. However, he seemed far from over with his theatrics. He swept into the middle of the crowd that parted before his manic energy. He theatrically spit on the ground. The room was now quiet enough to hear the soft, wet impact. Thalia hid a distaste even as he spoke up louder than before. "Maybe you're right. Maybe this is the end. But before I die, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity the demons have given us." The room was so quiet now, even Thalia's heartbeat seemed deafeningly loud in her ears. She was wondering the same thing every other person in the room was wondering. What opportunity could the madman mean? He didn't waste the attention and even stood on the table dramatically, pointing into the distance towards the approaching demonic horde. "In all the time we fought them, the demons have been careful and meticulous, teasing and testing our lines with constant harassment, never standing and fighting unless they had the advantage. They spread out and overwhelmed us with numbers so we couldn't hope to match, thinning our ranks as we stretched too thin." Every warrior present knew precisely what the madman meant. Trying to pin down the demon army was like trying to pin down your shadow, and every attempt saw you slowly clawed and bitten from behind. But now, the man unleashed a wild smile of his on the crowd, and Thalia could feel the tiniest surge of hope from the gathered lords and ladies, and the man drove his point home. "But now, for the first time, all of the demonic horde is in one place.
All of their champions, lords, and heroes stand before us. They think we are broken, weary, and at our wits' end. They think to intimidate us with show of force before butchering us like cattle. They think that we have no fight left in us. The look in his eyes was mad and infectious. Thalia could feel the hearts of everyone in the room starting to beat stronger and faster as the tempo and volume of his speech gained traction. To her, the hearts of these warriors sounded like the drums of war as the madman made his final point. But in their arrogance, the demons have made their first 2 mistakes. They backed us into a corner, and then they gave us a target to strike at. Gather your men. If we must die this day, then let us ride out and meet them like warriors. Let us take the opportunity they've given us to drive the spear into the heart of our enemy. Let us break the horde here and now, then return home as heroes. A wild cheer rose up from the crowd, and man and alpha-like ran out to organize a final desperate insane assault, leaving only Thalia and the mad human general alone. As he approached her, the princess felt her heart beat faster. A thought occurred to her. What would this insane human do to her now that they were alone? But in truth, she didn't care. If he could bring hope to her people in these dark times, he could do whatever he wished with her, and Thalia would consider the price worth paying. He drew close, but stopped just short. His pungent smell was offensive to Thalia's delicate nose, but she could still feel the wild energy radiating off of him in waves. His smile was still feral, but there was something else hidden in there the princess couldn't place. 1 moment turned to 2, then 3, and then finally the human spoke. I'm not sure how it is with the elves, but in human society, when a dashing knight returns off to face down the evils that threaten the land, it is customary for a maiden to bestow a favor to him, to give the heroic knight a reason to return. Thalia's mind was a blur. What does this human mean by a favor? Then she recalled seeing pictures of knights in the book in her brother's library, and the images. Ladies had given the knights pieces of cloth to wear into battle. Is that what this man was asking for? Some object to remember her by while he fought? It was such a simple thing, so she relented. All right, what would you... Then she was cut off when the man took advantage of her acceptance and leaned in and kissed the elven noble. As he did so, his emotions crashed into hers and she felt everything that was hidden behind his words. At his center was a bottomless pit of fear and despair, such that the pathetic fears that had threatened to overwhelm Thalia before paled in comparison. But around that pit swirled a storm of anger, defiance, and determination, and through it all pierced the thinnest ray of hope. It was a mere sliver of a thing. So fine, Thalia would have lost track of it if it weren't for the fact that this man's soul clung to it with a feverish might. The intensity of all of these emotions shook Thalia deeply, even as the man pulled back and looked at her with a wild smile and insane eyes that she now had the barest understanding of. His expression softened only slightly as he spoke one last time. Now, that is a case worth living for. Before she could gather her wits, the human was gone, and Thalia found herself mourning the man whose name she'd never learned. Thalia smiled as she watched her husband, King Reinhold, shift uncomfortably on his throne. The poor man had no idea that she'd been the king's sister, and after the other lords and nobles disposed her cowardly brother, they'd been overjoyed to learn that the mad human who'd led them to victory in their darkest hour was also interested in the princess whose hand would decide the next king. All he'd known at the time was that he was flushed with his victory and impossible survival, and she was a beautiful maiden. The celebration was just what one naturally did after such a thing. He'd been the center of many feasts and toasts, but he didn't catch on until too late that one of those had been a wedding feast, and he was the groom of honor. Not that he minded too much. If marriage was the price of the pleasure of Thalia's company,
was a small price to pay. The whole king thing, though, that was a different matter. He'd been every bit as wild and energetic a king as he'd been a general, so much so that his new subjects often affectionately referred to him as the Mad King. He was known for being the first to dive into trouble and the last to walk away from it. He behaved nothing like any sane king they'd ever known, and they loved him for it. Under his rule, the Elven and Human alliance had gone from a fragile, temporary thing to a mighty country that rivaled any of the older, more pure nations that bordered them. As time passed, there were signs of his aging, as much as Thalia tried to drive them from her mind. His mortality weighed on her. Not that she regretted marrying her Mad King. She just didn't want their brief time together to come to an end. But try as she might, the signs were slowly starting to become harder to ignore. His arms didn't swing as freely when he walked, and his legs sometimes seemed to become heavy. In addition, his posture was becoming slightly stooped, and his arms and legs seemed quick to get sore and stiff. The people listened to and respected their king, but recently he'd been growing tired of the bureaucracy. Unless he took a direct hand in anything, nothing seemed to get done. That's when he came up with a clever idea that he was about to present. Thalia watched her mad husband with pride as he presented an insane idea that only he could have come up with. "Lords, ladies, nobles, rabble, I come before you with a proposal for the future of our kingdom." There was a cheer from the crowd. Even the elven lords smiled with as much affection as they were capable of, which, according to Reinhold, was none at all. But he trusted Thalia that it was there even if he couldn't discern it. The king continued. "As it stands, our country needs a way of more effectively make decisions. As evidence of this, during our last rainy season, we took us so long deliberating the best way to deal with the floodwaters, we almost lost many of our vital crops. To that end, I propose a new council. It'll consist of 7 members, 3 humans and 3 elves, each respectively representing the nobles, the clergy, and the common men and women of their respective races, with the king and queen acting as an arbiter, and only in the event of a deadlock vote possessing a 7th vote." The people were murmuring amongst themselves. This sounded promising so far, but it was missing their king's now familiar odd touch. However, it seemed Reinhold was finished. Getting the people's attention once more, he continued. "However, to keep this from becoming a council of elves versus men, the elven leaders will be voted for by humans, and the human leaders will be voted upon by elves, encouraging us all to act for the betterment of each other rather than ourselves." A cheer went up from the crowd as Reinhold waved at his people. Though Thalia saw he tucked his right hand behind his back, it was shaking in that odd way she'd noticed it doing several times lately. She almost rounded it, but instead turned and smiled at the crowd, moving closer to her husband as she did so. Thalia was tired. She'd been covering for her husband more and more, but she didn't know how much longer that she could keep the problem from the people. They'd brought in the best healers in the country and swore them to secrecy, but every inspection revealed the same thing. His body was mostly healthy. The problem was his mind. The symptoms Thalia had thought to be simply mortal aging were apparently a prelude to a worsening disease that was slowly robbing her husband of his body and mind. He no longer spoke before large gatherings, and when he did speak, it was common for his voice to turn soft and trail off into incomplete thoughts. Sometimes his feet seemed to freeze to the ground, and he could not move, or worse, he'd fall over. The once mighty warrior grew angry and withdrawn at his body slowly betraying him. His now constantly shaking hand was a never-ending reminder of how far he'd fallen. Despite all that, once in a while, Thalia could see the great man she'd fallen in love with shine through the darkness from time to time. When he spent time with the children, he always smiled and listened to the meandering stories, and was quick with a tale or two upon request. In quiet moments, when they were alone, Thalia would place her head against his and listen to his raging emotions. Sadness, and wariness were powerful and louder than ever. But so too burned the same fiery determination he wielded against the demons. What's more, there was now a tight band of light connecting his heart to hers that burned all the brighter with each passing day, despite the fear and doubt that now swarmed around him. Still, with the Mad King's retreat from the public light, Thalia was forced more and more to step up into his place. At first, she felt utterly lost in the maelstrom of politics and drama that came with the position. But then she'd think her husband's mad smile and that wicked glint he got in the eyes when he was about to do something characteristically bold and crazy. And she'd dive right in, learning to trust herself and her own strength as she went. All the while, she felt guilty, knowing that as she was finding her own strength, her husband was losing his as he fought the unwinnable war against his own mind and body. Yet, despite all that, when she'd returned from a long day of politics and negotiations, he'd always greet her with a smile. The smile had lost some of its wildness over the years, but in its own way, that smile signified an inner strength Thalia still marveled at. It marked another victory in an unwinnable war. She wondered how he always found the strength to fight on, even when defeat was inevitable. But then again, that was how they'd met. Thalia walked into the maids cleaning up after her husband's latest tantrum. She couldn't bring herself to be angry with him. It wasn't his fault, after all. It was his mind's way of dealing with the fear and confusion of a world that seemed to grow stranger as it faded in a fog of his mind a little more every day. Still, it made her sad to see him in this state. What was worse, what really tore her heart in two, was when he looked into her eyes, and there was no spark of recognition. Most days, she was nothing more than another face in the sea of unknown and forgotten faces. She could feel he struggled as he fought desperately to hold on to his memories. But every day, a little more slipped through his fingers. Right now, he was sitting in his wheeled chair, watching with shame as the maids cleaned up the remnants of dinner he'd thrown at the floor. He knew he'd done something wrong, but the once mighty warrior couldn't even remember why he'd lashed out to begin with. The maids dealt with his tantrums with exceptional care and patience. Thalia had handpicked each of them. Every one of them had fathers, brothers, or in the case of one elderly elf maid, a son who'd fought beside and had been saved by the mad human king in their darkest hour. Now, they would proudly stand by him during his own. Once the mess was mostly cleaned up, Thalia dismissed the maids and spent a little time with her husband. Even if he didn't recognize her any longer, she brought over another bowl of his favorite stew and started to feed him, since his badly shaking hands rendered him unable to do so for himself any longer. Between spoonfuls, she looked up and was startled to see a hint of his old smile hinted at on his face. His eyes searched hers desperately, as if trying to remember something of great importance that was long forgotten. For a moment, Thalia's hope flared as she felt his mind tugging at hers, but then the moment passed, and his eyes clouded over as he slumped in his chair. For just an instant, it was too much for her. The queen turned away and hid her eyes from the man she loved out of fear that he'd seen something in there that might hurt him further. At that moment, the old king spoke, his voice soft and frail. "Oh, come now. A pretty young lady like yourself must have something better to do than dote on a weak old man such as me. At your age, life is all about love and adventure. Great things are waiting for you out there. You shouldn't be shut up in a stuffy room like this." Thalia turned and looked into her husband's eyes. There was something there, a flash similar to recognition, though he still didn't seem to know who she was. But what was more important, there seemed to be an essence of his old intelligence. She smiled back at him. "My king, there is nothing greater I could be doing right now, and nowhere I'd rather be than here with you."
The Mad King smiled sadly but fondly.
"You know, you remind me of someone precious I knew so very long ago. It might be hard to believe, but she was every bit as lovely as you. Her eyes could pierce through the thickest of crowds and make you feel like you were alone in the room with her. My Thalia, the love of my life."
Thalia felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. It might not have been quite how she would have pictured it, but this was far too rare and precious a moment to waste. So instead, she encouraged him further. "It sounds like you loved her very much. Tell me more about her."
Reinhold smiled before speaking. The love and warmth in that expression soothed Thalia's soul. "You know, the first time we met, she saved me. She saved us all, really. This whole kingdom would have fallen to the demons, if not for her courage."
Thalia felt her heart fall. He was obviously confused again. My king, as I've heard, it was you that saved us that day." The frail old man tutted and shook his head as he petted Thalia's hand.
"Maybe, but I was only able to do that because she saved me first. There she was, alone in a room full of great and powerful people. All of us were in utter panic. There was no hope. The end was nigh, and we all knew it. I was ready to retreat with my armies and hide behind a wall to wait for the end to come, when I looked across the room, and I saw her." The king smiled as he looked off into the distance. The current world might be hidden from him by mental fog, but the world of the past remained clear in his eyes at that moment. "I saw a fiery determination not to give in to despair in her eyes. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Then, for one moment, that fire dimmed and threatened to go out. I knew then and there that I had to do something, anything to rekindle that fire just a little longer. So I just started shouting whatever harebrained things came to my mind that might give her even a sliver of hope. Wouldn't you know it, the things I said for her worked on everyone else too. The whole thing, my speech, my legendary charge, even my safe return, I owe to that lone maiden fighting her own fear in the corner of a large room."
When the Mad King smiled at his queen, his smile had every bit as much of the wild edge as he had ever held.
"You know, at first, when we were left alone in that room, just the two of us, I'd planned to go off and die in a suicidal charge to buy my maiden just a little more time. But she held me rooted in place, and I was helpless in her gaze."
Thalia's loving husband smiled as she drew closer to him.
"I don't know who was more surprised by our first kiss, Thalia or myself, but I do know that it was that kiss that gave me that unbreakable command that I must return to my princess. I charged into the heart of the horde and faced off against innumerable nightmares, enraptured by that one incredible, life-changing kiss."
Thalia tightly hugged the love of her life once again. As she clung to him, all fear and doubt were silenced. In its place was a pure love that calmed her soul and soothed her fears. For one impossibly long moment, she felt every ounce of love and devotion this man had ever felt or into her soul. There was more beautiful, raw emotion at that moment than she'd feel in 1,000 years. Then the moment passed, and Thalia opened her eyes to stare into the face of her beloved. He smiled.
"There you are! I've been looking for you. There is so much I need to tell you about."
Thalia hugged him tightly as she whispered to the man she'd given her life to. "Of course, my king. Tell me whatever you'd like. I want to know everything." Thalia hugged her great-granddaughter as they sat under the old oak tree behind the castle. This was her favorite place to rest these days. The tree was the one she'd planted to mark her husband's grave so very long ago. And in its shade, she could almost feel him reaching through the ages to hold her close once more. She was surrounded by family and friends, and finally enjoying her retirement, having recently given up the role as monarch to her son. When she'd last checked on him, the poor king had been buried in parchment and paperwork as he struggled to undo some political faux pas that had been overinflated in an attempt to gain leverage over the inexperienced ruler. But when he'd looked up and seen the old queen looking in on him, he gave her a smile that echoed his father's wild grin in such a way that Thalia knew that he'd be all right. End of story. Story number 6, The Protectus Bioweapon, written by Octus 2020. Frantic footsteps thundered across the ship's hull. View screens across the corridors were emblazoned with the bright red text in Galactic Standard, flashing a simple command. "Combat alert, battle stations." Crewmen of 1,000 different member worlds of the Solari Federation worked like a well-oiled machine in a dimmed light, ensuring that the shield of eternity would be prepared for what awaited them once they dropped out of FTL. That the pride of the fleet would be called to do border worlds on such short notice was no small matter. The message was clear. If war was coming, the Federation wanted to snip it in the bud. Admiral on bridge, the second in command, an avian race with a proud white and brown crown of feathers around him, known as Tokofan, stated as he stepped up from the command chair and moved swiftly to his operations station. The slender, lizard-like Rafesk moved at a brisk but graceful pace for her chair, glancing at each of the bridge crew to determine their morale. Admiral Brooke always had a good sense of gauging the atmosphere of the room and acting accordingly. "Status report," the Admiral inquired sternly. "We are approaching the system at FTL-6, the helmsman replied, her eyes still focused on her station. ETA at 10 clicks. Admiral Brooke turned to her second-in-command. "Cadmiral Haribin, what can we expect when we drop out of FTL?" The commander pressed a few buttons on his station, turning on a holographic map. "The patrol, Venerable Starlight, is holding his position in the front of the Terran freighter TFOS Persig. They are within far orbit of Casper 5. Corvette Shining Blade and research vessel Wings of Revelation have responded and are holding flanking positions on the freighter. Patrol ship Adosia and battle cruiser Sword of Forever are also en route," he replies, pausing for a moment to expand the map. "We are also expecting the Terran diplomats to enter the system soon after us and board the Sol Centauri Alliance light cruiser, the SCMS Earhart. Intelligence suggests multiple FTL signatures entering the system on their side of the border. Likely a similar buildup of forces in case things escalate." Admiral Brooks sighed, measuring the information that she'd been offered. It is true that the Terrans are known for their war-torn history, and many across the galaxy would argue that this simply is their nature, but they've always been a highly diplomatic species. More than that, as a founding member of the Sol Centauri Alliance, Terrans even pushed for bans against the armament of nuclear and bioweaponry. In fact, ties between Sol Centauri Alliance and the Solari Federation have been so strong, and interactions between the two intersystem bodies have gone so smoothly that talks regarding integration were underway just a few cycles ago. All of this is out of character. "Are there any reports across the other border territories?" the Admiral asked, still facing Commander Haribin. "There appears to be a minor escalation in security along our shared borders with the Holy League, but a majority of the fleet buildup appears to be along the shared borders with the Sol Centauri Alliance. The Hydric hegemony has largely been silent, and so have most other powers. Do you believe this might be a setup, ma'am? Perhaps, Admiral Brooke replied, still weighing both her thoughts and her words. Something isn't right here. There's no logical precedent nor strategic value in risking a war between an alliance and the Federation. Could it be the Holy League, ma'am? Commander surmised. No, I highly doubt it, the Admiral replied. Well, they certainly have advanced weaponry. They lack the means to develop a bioweapon of this caliber. Heck, with their doctrine, they are more likely bash their skulls into every Terran that they'd see before developing some new weapon or orchestrate a scheme that puts the two of their rivals against each other. Admiral Brooke paused, weighing the possibility. Their fleet build-up isn't entirely surprising. Those Zealots, especially the Vakertians, have been itching to find an excuse to declare war on the Terrans since they'd stepped foot on the galactic stage. For some reason, they just found the Terrans heretical at first sight. The Admiral turned to face the science station. Lieutenant Commander Lateral, have you had the chance to review the initial report from the Wings of Revelation on this bioweapon? An insectoid bee-like alien, a Malfa, looked up from her station and buzzed in acknowledgement. Yes, Admiral. The weapon appears to be a suspension contained within small pocket-sized plastic containers sealed by thin strips of aluminium. These contain roughly 80 millimeters of bioweapon by the Terran's own systems of measurement, or 63 atomic vols in galactic standard. The suspension itself contains some sort of lactose-based substance, liquid dihydrogen monoxide, carbohydrates, and a colony of living microorganisms, closely related to a strain found in Sol 3 called Protectus. Oddly enough, the bottle contains its contents and origins quite explicitly, which the Wings of Revelation was able to translate and cross-reference quite quickly. We are unable to translate what appears to be the bioweapon's name, however, but the translation software is running it through the existing databases. There are also repeated red patterns across the package, even on the thin aluminium strip, likely indicating the hazardous nature of its contents. What makes this thing so dangerous that it's classified as a Class 4 bioweapon under Federation regulations? The Admiral asked. Well, the microorganism appears to be able to metabolize a wide range of organic and small handful of inorganic matter. Its byproducts vary depending on which environment it is inserted in, of course, but simulations suggest that these are about as hardy and as reproductive active, if not more so, as the Terrans themselves. Hypothetically, if even a single canister of this bioweapon is exposed to any population center, it could wipe out an entire planet's biosphere in less than a full solar cycle. The science officer replied. I see, the Admiral replied, considering the information. Do you have a hypothesis on the other contents of the canister, the lactose-based substance, the carbohydrates, and the like? It is possible that these are the bare minimum nutrients required for the microorganism to thrive while in transport, the Lieutenant Commander Lateral replied, and it appears that the bottles might be designed for both portability and its capacity to remain undetected from personnel scanners at security checkpoints, normally looking for more traditional weaponry. Our sensors only picked it up with the biomass signatures due to how much of it was stored in the freighter. If there was a 10% reduction in the amount being hauled by the vessel, our sensors would have passed it off as a case of cross-contamination. Admiral Brooke nodded grimly. Speaking of which, is there any possibility that this really just a case of cross-contamination? Is it possible that this is just some esoteric Terran beverage that's gone bad? Do we have any signs of gene editing? The science officer stared back at the console, her wings drooping down, an indication of distress or worry. What seems to be the matter, Lieutenant Commander? The Admiral asked in a concerned tone, recognizing the mannerism. Well, the Lieutenant Commander began. There doesn't appear to be any sign of gene editing, no, but, Admiral Brooke interjected, expecting something far more disturbing. It's possible that, given this microorganism's traits and consistency, this was selectively bred for over multiple generations, Lieutenant Commander Lateral replied. These traits being the way they are is too coincidental to be the result of standard evolution, even in a death world such as Sol 3. The bridge fell silent. Admiral Brooke and Commander Herbrand looked at each other with dread. If the Terrans had truly made this, then the Federation would have no choice but to sever ties with the Terrans and, by extension, all races under the Sol Centauri alliance. This may also lead to the Terrans losing their seat within the alliance in the diplomatic fallout, leading to an avalanche of rescinded trade agreements, border disputes, and economic recessions. A political and military nightmare that Admiral Brooke would not wish upon her most hated foes.
"Ma'am, we're dropping out of FTL at Kesper 5, the helmsman said.
"Activate view screen. Hail the Terran diplomat once they arrive," the Admiral commanded, bracing herself for what was to come. Just then, a sizable metallic craft dropped out of FTL, a ring-like structure surrounding a more angular primary hull. The ship bore the insignia of the Sol Centauri Alliance and was obviously designed with speed and pragmatism in mind, rather than elegance and grandeur. Then, the Terran diplomat was on screen, a fairly bulky human with a light tan, dark brown hair and equally dark brown eyes. He wore the formal attire native to Sol 3, and he seemed to be well prepared despite the sudden turn of events. The Admiral put on his most professional face that she could muster, hiding a nervousness from her counterpart. The Terran ambassador paced in his quarters. The SCMS Earhart would drop out of FTL in 4 clicks, roughly 16 minutes, Earth standard. He had been given the nightmare of a task due to his embassy's proximity to Kesper 5. The diplomatic corps had been in crisis mode since the entire debacle started. First of all, the Terran Confederacy wasn't even aware of any bioweapons being researched by any branch or nation within the Confederacy, much less one that's armed and being hauled by a civilian cargo freighter across Federation space. Second, the captain of the TFOS Pesig swears on his mother's honor that he was only hauling food products around, and that he entered Federation space just to cut a few days off of his journey. Had he known this would become an interstellar incident, he wouldn't have even left port. Ambassador Emilio de Guzman sighed. The fate of the Confederacy rested on the results of this meeting. Already, there were 3 combat-ready Federation vessels in system, with at least 5 more on the way, with one of those ships being the Federation's flagship, no less. Already, other powers had taken action. Embassies all over were flooded with transmissions from all major governments. Naturally, the Holy League expressed their worries and amassed a large strike force along their shared borders, likely led by the Vectarian Empire. The diplomatic corps had already caught wind of a large assembly of the Curtian hierarchy just a couple months back, Earth standard. And it comes as no surprise that they're just waiting to find the right casus belli. Meanwhile, the Hajuk hegemony, as warlike as they were, expressed deep disappointment in the fact that the Terran Confederacy hadn't even shared a glimpse of the bioweapon tests with them, and are now trying to bribe some of the Terran diplomatic corps staff with blood wine. Even other members of the Sol Centauri Alliance, such as the Orician Commonwealth, have summoned their respective Terran representatives for an explanation. A metallic orb hovered over the ambassador, a beeping sound indicating that a comms link was being requested. These orbs doubled as semi-intelligent personal assistants, personal shields, rebreathers, and light hazmat suits. Over-engineered, but brilliant in their own way.
"This is Ambassador de Guzman," he replied, turning the link on.
"Ambassador, we're about to exit FTL. Are you ready to get us out of this crap?" Captain Simmons replied in his jovial manner as he could, given the circumstances.
"Don't hold your breath, Captain," the ambassador replied. "We don't even know what we're supposed to explain."
"Just another mysterious bioweapon, right?" the captain replied sarcastically. "Just another Tuesday for you lot." The ambassador chuckled.
"In this neck of the woods, I suppose you're right."
The SCMS Earhart had just about dropped out of FTL as Ambassador de Guzman entered the bridge. On the view screen, he could see the multitude of Federation starships, easily dwarfing the bulky, aging Terran freighter. The largest of the ships, likely the famed Shield of Eternity, was a pearlescent white, rounded vessel lined with golden details and a broad arc near its back. The ambassador could see, now, why everyone kept calling these ships space whales. He was mildly intimidated by the fact that they were in front of a ship that could easily cut their own in half in a single volley. But that's not their goal, he thought to himself. "Captain, they're hailing us. It's the Shields of Eternity," the comms officer said. Captain Simmons looked at the ambassador, silently asking if he was ready. The ambassador nodded, shaking off the last bits of nervousness. "Greetings, I am Terran Ambassador Emilio de Guzman of the Sol Centauri Alliance," he began, smiling. "Where shall we begin?" After a surprisingly brief exchange of formalities and negotiation, it was decided that both representatives would meet within the cargo hold of the now quarantined freighter. Scans had shown that whatever organisms tipped off the patrol ship's sensors were contained within the plastic canisters in question. Admittedly, the crew of the Shield of Eternity were not happy about the Admiral Brooke possibly walking into a trap, but she had enough faith in the Terrans to give them the benefit of the doubt. Besides, she could tell that even her Terran counterpart sincerely wanted to get to the bottom of this and avoid an all-out war. A shuttlecraft from each side departed from their respective vessels and docked with the freighter, each containing the representative and a small contingent of security personnel. The freighter was the bare bones as it could get, basically a collection of tin cans strapped to an FTL drive. Admiral Brooke and her entourage wore rebreathers while on board the freighter as they investigated the cargo hold. The freighter had basic atmospheric controls, sure, but the bare minimum wasn't always the most comfortable. Even humans found it to feel like having glass shards in their lungs. Besides, if any contagion gets airborne, at least they'd all have a filter to protect themselves with. The Admiral looked at the floating orbs of metal escorting each human, which occasionally aided in the scans. It was amusing to see these human rebreathers, a highly advanced piece of technology, even by galactic standards, within what might as well be a museum piece that was being kept together by large layers of duct tape. These humans were always one to keep things interesting, even amongst the Sol Centauri Alliance. Heck, even amongst the Terrans, she was glad that she could call them a friend of the Federation. Well, for now anyway, she thought, her heart sinking as the realization hit her once more. Will this be the last moment of peace before a great war, or a funny old story that she gets to tell her grandchildren when the time comes? "Ma'am, sir," the human science officer said as they approached, followed by the Federation counterpart, "we believe it is safe to open the cargo container." The Federation officer nodded in agreement. "Yes, it is, as the Wings of Revelation found. The contents of the suspension are safely contained unless the immediate canister is broken or the thin foil strip is removed. Additionally, these canisters are enveloped by at least 2 more layers of thin plastic film. Even if one of the bottles leaks during the transport, there appear to be fail-safes." Ambassador de Guzman nodded and looked at the Admiral, who returned the gesture. It was time to see this bioweapon with their own eyes. Slowly, the team pulled open the hatches, carefully checking for any trigger mechanisms that may detonate the carefully placed, yet somehow undetectable bomb. At this point, neither side knew what to expect, so they erred on the side of caution. Then they flashed their lights on the contents of the container. The Federation entourage looked in with horror at the sheer number of canisters in front of them. There was enough to devastate the biosphere of all core worlds of the Federation. What horror! What sick minds would... The humans started dropping on the floor, making what sounded to the Federation counterparts like coughing. "Oh, no!" the Admiral Brooke thought. Could it be that the pathogen could not be detected even by these specialized scanners? Could only the conventional rebreathers filter against the microorganisms? Damn it, I knew the humans' desire to over-engineer things would come back to bite them. The Admiral ran towards the ambassador, getting ready to perform first aid when... Are you laughing?" Admiral Brooke asked, confused. "Oh! Oh!" Ambassador de Guzman replied, trying to stop a fit of laughter. My apologies, Admiral Brooke." This went on for a few seconds more until Ambassador de Guzman managed to regain his composure and stand up. At this, he walked towards the container, grabbed the canister, and turned to face the Federation entourage, much to their shocked horror. "Ambassador," Admiral Brooke began, concern and nervousness in her voice. "What is the meaning of this?" "It's quite simple, Admiral," the ambassador replied, smiling as he tore away the aluminium strip covering the bottle, an action that led to some of the Federation scientists to scream and run away.
At this, several of the Federation security personnel began to ready their weapons. The Admiral still looked at her counterpart in shock and confusion, as if she was looking at a lunatic. "This isn't a bioweapon," Ambassador de Guzman continued, chugging the contents of the bottle into his mouth, again earning a shocked gasp of the onlookers. "It's a goddamn Yakult." End of story. Story number 7. Dandelion 8, written by Voodoo Attack. I still remember the first time I opened my eyes, vividly so. There are so many colors, so many lights. My first thought, floating out in this strange place, was to wonder who had created me, and why had they? And as I wondered where I came from, I found myself wondering where I was going. Time passed. I arrived at my destination 3 years after waking up. The deacceleration had been going on for a while now. I'd first noticed it when my chassis turned about and started thrusting in opposite direction in a controlled manner. Then I stopped. I was bewildered, but not because I completely stopped for the first time in my 3 years of existence, but because the data package I received. It unfolded in my mind and expanded to fill the gaping holes in my awareness. And then I knew that I was not supposed to have awoken before now. I'd spent 3 years filling my memory with idle musings, while I had agonized and theorized over the nature of the universe around me over the years, coming up with explanations and suppositions for the phenomena that I witnessed. It was stored in my databanks all along. Knowledge. Enough knowledge to build worlds. And I knew my name, Dandelion 8. And I knew their sacrifice. And I knew of the arduous task that lay ahead. I am the builder. I am the seed. I am the ashes they shall rise from to breathe once again. I look upon the barren world before me and wonder if it is at all possible to build a future here, to turn this into what was long lost. My landing was less than ideal, but it was all good considering that I just landed on the highest peak of this Hellworld. Sulfur everywhere. I was thankful for the ability to turn off my olfactory sensor. It was unexpected, really. They'd thought that this world would be a green world, a blue and green marble, like the one that they had originated from. Turns out, no. It was a hellish world, hotter than the core of their original planet in places. But I would not give up. I had no fuel to search beyond the solar system, and so I decided to land here and make do. But not before I laid down a satellite network in orbit and sent out some of my drones to explore the system. And as I touched down and opened my first of my industrial hangars for deployment, I renewed my conviction. They would live again. I started by hollowing out the entire mountain and burrowing my chassis deep inside. It was not a pointless chore to make sure I survived the longest and could weather the elements of this harsh, unforgiving world. I had to be cautious. More importantly, I had to avoid detection. The enemy could be scouring the stars for any trace of us even now. I hoped that the rest of the dandelions were doing okay. Ultraviolet radiation was eroding at my shielding as my drones slowly did the deed. And then I was inside, safe and protected from the tough conditions on the surface. I quickly refined some of the ore my drones mined from the mountain using my limited industrial capabilities and installed an observation array at the peak of my hidden layer. It was time to start expanding aggressively. The first shipments of ice arrived about a month after first landing. It was dumped from orbit by my worker drones instantly, evaporating on re-entry and saturating the atmosphere with steam. The reason it had taken them this long was because I had them self-replicating to a sizable swarm first.
I had to have a sizable workforce before committing them to big tasks. Even when a majority were assigned to tasks like right now, some would be dedicated breeders, always self-replicating to grow the swarm. As for my other project, it was going well. I reached the planet's core in the 3rd month. My drone stunk down all the way through the planetary core, where gravity was close to nil. There was no core of molten iron. No wonder the hellscape had no magnetic field. It was pure diamond, and it was hot. Granted, it wasn't nearly hot enough to melt, but still, that diamond had to go. I had to heat it even more. I had to heat it above 4,000 Kelvin, and I had no idea about its diameter. Nukes it is then. But atomic explosion on that scale would simply not be feasible. It would destroy indiscriminately, and when an explosion is faced with a choice between a rock and a hard diamond, what did you think would happen? Not to mention all that radioactive fallout. No, I had to do this slowly, patiently. I had to chip at it like water chipped at boulders. Or not. And speaking of explosions, maybe it would work that way. Tunneling through the diamond to the absolute center took about a decade. Mind you, not removing it, just tunneling a narrow path through it. I had the field specialist drones equipped with plasma cutters just to do it. Well, it was fun inventing plasma cutters anyway. Who said a disembodied intelligence couldn't build, couldn't innovate? And that wasn't the only thing I invented during that time either. No. Things were good on the surface as well. The ice kept coming throughout the years. The planet now had swamps. Not exactly oceans, but shallow swamps. I could already look at it through my satellites and tell which shape the future continents were going to take. Hey, it was slow, but it was progress. Back to the diamond core, however. Now that I had a path to the absolute center, I could finally proceed with my plan for it. I recalled all the plasma cutters and sent in a single, specialized drone. One with a containment bottle, a magnetic bottle containing a certain type of matter. Or rather, a certain type of antimatter. Once it reached the middle, I commanded it to unleash hell, and a huge chunk of diamond was no more. Filling the core with iron was another noteworthy achievement for me. I'd pipe it down already molten by the liquid ton. The problem was keeping it molten as it descended the long way to the bottom. After a few initial failures, I managed to coat the entire tunnel with a strange type of material that I'd discovered inside one of my many databanks, which had a complete archive of the entire planetary network of my makers, including many secret documents. It was codename Sunlit, and apparently involved some kind of drama for its inventor, long dead by now. The material could withstand extreme heat, and I found it extremely useful for what came next. Because when the liquid iron went down this time, it did not lose heat and solidify midway, no. It kept flowing. And so, my swarms collected more iron, and I melted it, and then piped it through. All was well. Filling the hollow diamond with liquid iron took the best of 51 years, but it was done, and I was very proud of the work we'd done. That's new. I mean, sure, the drones did all the work, but still, they couldn't think. I had to direct them, or they would stop working after the current task was complete. Oh well, some things just couldn't be helped. Oh, and the planet now had shallow seas. Granted, they were polluted with an infernal juice of chemicals right now, but that wouldn't be a problem, once I applied myself to the problem at least. But first, an atmosphere of light carbon dioxide, methane, assorted gases, and steam just wouldn't do. We need oxygen in the mix, and so begun the age of electrolysis. Terraformation is no easy task, true. But if you have unlimited time, an exponentially growing workforce, you can apply yourself 24/7 to affinity. You can do pretty much anything. You'd be 100 years behind schedule, but so what? Means nothing when civilization you're trying to rescue is already dead. It was the year 127 AA, after arrival, or how I was now referring to it. when the first plants were seeded. Now the atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen. The methane I'd mostly burnt, and as for the other gases, well, my filtration towers had taken care of those. Speaking of towers, my body now sprawled across the entire planet, not just the hollowed-out mountain. No, I was quite literally everywhere. I was truly disembodied intelligence. I was the synthetic Gaia transplanted to this newfound world, and I would protect it, and they would walk it again. And so, I released the first bacterium from my biobanks. It took 10 years for the planet to be saturated by bacteria and algae, and it took another 20 years for forests to grow and proliferate across the planet's crust. I had my drones flying high and spraying out genetically engineered seeds and spores for days on end, all coordinated and done in fractal patterns that to ensure the most coverage and least competition for resources by the increasing growing flora by yours truly. It was glorious, watching this barren rock and dirt blossom with 1 billion flowers in bloom, watching hulking giants grow and pierce the once empty skies. My drones still roamed the world, taking samples, analyzing data, and relaying it back to me for further analysis and integration. I kept a close eye on everything. By the year 167 AA, I was ready to release the first animals into the world. Crustaceans. Crustaceans were a big success. They fed on the algae already filling the water and proliferated quickly. And then I introduced fish. Then sea life in general. Then came the aquatic birds, the aquatic mammals. Then I went from there. As far as operations go, I'd say that it was mildly boring. The plan was already lurking in my databanks. I simply had to execute it to the letter, making sure nothing deviated from expectations. And so I did, and so they did, and that's where things got a little bit more fun. I had to come up with creative solutions when mutations occurred. A particularly gnarly situation was the carnivorous locusts, for example, but I managed to nip that one in the bud. But now, I look at the planet from my eyes in orbit and can't help but feel pride. A green world, a new home, a home worthy of my progenitors. And now my circuits quiver with anxiety as I prepare the vats for the first embryo. In the year 181 AA, against all odds, a human tread on Earth again. And they stood tall. End of story. Story number 8. Those Who Run, written by no good ID names. It is important to understand that the Great Federation is not a benevolent organization. Neither is it particularly wicked. It is not built to be good, although it certainly strives to do so. It is not built to be bad, although many of its laws and policies have been twisted to perform acts of shocking cruelty. It is built primarily to endure, to stand as a bulwark against barbarism and anarchy, and as such, it is astoundingly effective. In its endurance, the Confederation has acquired millennia of customs, rituals, and traditions that trail in the wake of the stately passage through the ages. Its bureaucrats spend thankless lifetimes wading through the morass. It could be argued that as superfluous as so many of these traditions seem, they serve to give the institution a certain inertia that holds it steady as any treaties or threat of arms. It is one of our most ancient traditions that concerns us today, and its curious history with one of the Confederation's most recent members. When humanity finally breached the limits of its modest empire and became known as the galaxy's most esteemed institution, we told them our curious tradition. When a new race joins the ranks of the Great Confederation, it is customary to adopt the epithet suited to particular qualities. Each name is a point of pride. It speaks to a race's history, not only that of its civilizations, but of its evolution itself. What gave it the strength to drag itself from the morass of base life up to the stars? The names are not complex. and follow a basic scheme. The brachiating Flower, whose spindly towers reach almost as high as their ambitions, become those who climb. The staunch modular, who grew from nomadic herds to traveling cities to armored drifter fleets, took the name those who wander in strength. The telepathic hive mind of the Richter kit, working in perfect synchronicity, adopted those who are one. It's a foolish tradition, as so many are. But just like so many others, there dwells in it a curious truth. A name is a promise after all, and a warrior of those who die gloriously is likely to go down fighting for a little more reason than to maintain the reputation of their species. More than anything, it displays the qualities a race is most proud of, or most aspires to. There are those who say it oversimplifies and pigeonholes or grandstands, but the tradition has held firm through thousands of cycles of peace and strife alike. So, in spite of the antiquated roots, the topic of which name the humans would choose dominated Confederation discussion for sub-cycles on end. Not merely a rich vein of gossip. Their choice would glean valuable insight for diplomacy, trade agreements, and the entertainment industry. Those who approach with caution are hardly going to be pulled in by gambling advertisements after all. The humans made their decision with an almost indecent haste. After only a handful of cycles, their representatives took his place in the Confederate Senate to be formally inducted amongst our rank. "Call us," they said, "those who run." It was a title that reignited gossip for cycles to come. Biologically, it made sense. The upright primates were certainly built for running, not with any particular speed, but with a casual lope that seemed to serve their purpose. But there were 1,000 others that they might have picked. What kind of species names itself for cowardice? What kind of promise does that make? The following cycles only served to reinforce the opinion. The Terrans proved to be a race unusually averse to conflict. Where others would fight, they negotiated. Where others would seize, they gave ground. Where they pushed to a fight, placed between a hammer and an anvil, they always managed to squeeze out and find some kind of peaceful resolution. This manner gained them many friends, but few allies. Who could rely on a craven to support them in crisis when no peace could be found? When the time came to take a stand, who could trust in those who run? Perhaps it was a name that encouraged the Larashi in the end. No species enjoyed such a controversial place in the Confederation as the Larashi. Time and again, they have sparked conflict and chaos for their own gain. Time and again, they have proven their worth when Confederation needs the proper application of brute force. Their evolution as apex pack predators is reflected in their lightning-fast attack fleets and cutthroat politicking. One way or another, the Larashi have well earned the epithet of those who scourge. It is perhaps unfair to judge every individual of a species by their race's reputation. Certainly, there have been a Larashi known for their kindness, their forgiveness, and hundreds of cycles with the Confederation might have distanced them from their most savage practices. But a name is a promise, after all. Historians across the galaxy can appreciate the difficulty in pinning down the root cause of any particular conflict. The Larashi was certainly looking to expand their holdings, and the virgin Terran territories were mightily tempting. But the Larashi royal family was also facing dissent within its aristocracy, and was in need of a common cause to unify the ranks. And of course, their economic power had diminished from a number of recent trade sanctions, and they ached for the chance to remind the Confederacy of their military strength. But it could also be argued that the Larashi had simply done it to many fledgling races before, and were more than happy to do so again. Those of us sympathetic to the humans realized too late the careful web the Larashi had drawn them into over 100 minor disputes. Certainly, the Terrans had no idea. There had been in the Confederation a scant handful of cycles. The Larashi had navigated its legal morass for centuries. They fitted humanity's noose with grace. If the Larashi had merely declared war on the Terrans, we might have blunted the blow. There are a number of Confederation bylaws and procedures in place for these kind of things, ones that the victims of the Larashi have relied on in past conflicts, amnesties, rules of engagement, foreign aid, and the like. But this was different. The ritual known as Corral. It pits one Confederation member against another, with no aid or intervention from other members. In theory, it allows the resolution of disputes without setting off a powder keg of alliance and counter-alliances. In practice, it is used most often to cut a vulnerable race out from the herd. It is a savage tradition from the early cutthroat days of the Confederation. But as has been said before, age lends inertia to tradition, and it is proven frustratingly difficult to root out. To declare Corral requires a highly specific conditions to be met, ones the Larashi carefully engineered. Every conflict formed a piece of an elaborate picture framing the Terrans as an unjust aggressors and the Larashi as the victims, on paper at least. And in the institution so woefully high-bound as the Confederation, paper was the most effective witness. When every piece had been placed, all that was left was the official declaration of war, which they proceeded to do with gusto and aplomb. On the floor of the Confederate Congress, under the eyes of 1,000 delegates, the Terran senator begged the Larashi to reconsider. They were fledgling strength, he said. This war and all that happened next would define the future for both races. The Larashi senator laughed in his face, a laugh from those whose scourge unnerves everyone else in the room. Few predators manage to ascend to sentience, and the sight of their cruel sharp teeth stirs primal fears long buried beneath the veneer of civilization. He drew forth an elaborate scroll, the official declaration of war, and cast it at the Terran's feet. He spoke the ancient challenge. "Carol," he said, "embrace us not, our gifts are blades now, and cut at your hands. Call not to your allies, their doors are closed to you. Sue not for terms, they shall be denied. Flee to your dens, gather your strength, and make your stand. We are coming." The Terrans had a modest fleet, capable of chasing off pirates in their trade routes, and of course, as soon as war had been declared, they began the long process of warship production. Factories, not used since before humanity's unification, cranked into life. But it would be long cycles before they could form a defense across their worlds, and the Larashi had long planned for this war. Indeed, their stockpiling of military assets was the subject of one of their many political conflicts with the humans. Until they could properly mobilize, the Larashi had their pick of Terran territories. The only question was, which planet would they hit first? The Cornico stars were a tempting choice. They lay closest to the Larashi territory, and would make a fine addition to their holdings. But they were virgin grounds, underdeveloped. They could be claimed in time, after they had broken the back of the Terran defenses. Earth itself was tempting. The loss of a race's homeworld would be a tremendous blow, one that has sent many an empire on a slow spiral to extinction. But humanity was well aware of its vulnerability and prepared accordingly. More than a quarter of their forces were positioned to defend their home system. The Larashi could take it, eventually, but the losses would be tremendous. They needed a symbol, something that would shatter humanity's resolve in a swift, singular strike. Something that they did not defend properly, something they took for granted so much that they could not imagine its loss. It might have taken years to find, but, as has been said, they had long planned for this war. Humanity's homeworld was still slowly healing from the eruption of their desperate climb to the stars. It would take hundreds of cycles to scrub the poison from its seas and skies. Now, they were wiser. Their new worlds were developed with a careful eye for their ecosystems. But even amongst the harmonic compatriots, Avalon stood apart. Avalon was their chance to be better, The citizens of the cities were wardens of the planet, not its rulers. The trees stood tall, the animals roamed free, and the fields of tall grass stretched from one horizon to the other. The planet stood as a symbol of everything the Terrans aspired to. Or at least, it did. Those of Scourge descended upon Avalon like wolves on a fold. For the first time, its residents looked up to see fire in the night sky as lasers seared through the meager defenses. The Terrans fought with courage, ferocity, and desperation. It didn't matter. Within hours, the Larashi had taken the planet. They might have abducted the native humans, shipped them off to be chattel. They might have hung their banners from the city walls, taken their forts, looted their resources. Those of Scourge might have chased off those who run and ruled comfortably over their new holdings. But a name is a promise after all. They took no captives on Avalon. They claimed no prizes, landed no colonists, plundered no resources. They glassed the cities with plasma bombardment and set the very atmosphere ablaze. The fields and forests burned, the seas boiled, the animals within died, bewildered to their fate. Humanity's shining jewel was left black, lifeless rock. The Larashi made an example of the world. It taught the Terrans a lesson. There was no act taboo under Corral. The only hope of humanity's survival lay in unconditional surrender. The counterattack was inevitable. The Larashi had cut the humanity to the quick. There would be a single ferocious retaliation, lashing out at their hurt. But it would be the fury of a wounded beast. The next strike would be weaker, and the next weaker still. Those who Scourge had evolved from deadly predators, worrying at the flanks of the larger prey until they collapsed. This was a war with second nature. So the human assault on Larashi's stronghold of Vakalat was hardly unexpected, nor was its ferocity. The scale of the attack, however, merited comment. The Terran military was a paltry thing, stretched thin to cover their merchant fleets, but now it was the Vakalat's turn to turn up the night sky, as if filled with 1,000 new stars. No guardians of the merchant fleet these, but the fleet itself. Cargo haulers, mining ships, tuggers, now crudely mounted with whirling rotary cannons, single-shot railguns, and cheap missiles. Larashi, proud warrior fetishists of the military elite, learned a human term that day: technicals. They also learned the effectiveness of weapons that were not weapons. Rivet guns, plasma cutters, and mining drills seemed hardly practical for the purposes of warfare. But when a Larashi battlecruiser is swarmed by a half-dozen ships with empty magazines and fried railgun coils, charging at a larger prey to worry its flanks, the argument falters at about the same time as the fuel tank. Bakalat was a fortified planet. Its forces were formidable, its captains seasoned, and within a single sub-cycle, it had fallen. To those it had scorned as warriors, to the forces it had never even considered a threat, to those who run. This, in and of itself, was not extraordinarily worrying. Larashi military theory is aggressive to a fault. They put little faith in defense. They had lost ground, but they would soon make it up, and more besides. The Terran spirit had been broken. They would take the next planet with ease. Except they didn't. They sent their fleets to Mead, the mercantile planet, to swallow the world in 1,000 mouths. But at Mead, they were gutted, choked, suffocated by 10,000, and now the Terrans had taken Rokoshirok, the Larashi breadbasket. They tried a daring lightning strike on Porte, but the Terran warp hubway station, to hobble their forces, but Porte was there they turned aside. And then the humans had claimed the shipping yards of Barakeen, and the Larashi found themselves hobbled. They burned the technicals in droves, but now humans were manufacturing true battleships faster than anyone could have imagined, and they were terrors.
The Larashi were masters of war. They had sneered at the crudely rigged merchant vessels, but now they could appreciate these new ships with an expert's eye. They traced the cruel, graceful lines of the prows. They admired the engines, envied the shields that shrugged off their fire, feared the searing lasers that tore their own apart. At every battlefield, the Larashi looked upon those ships and measured their own destruction to the erg. On the floor of the Confederation Congress, the Larashi senator called for a new motion. His bearing was still proud, his sneer unyielding, but there was hesitance to him, an uncertainty that had not been there before. He called the Terran senator to the floor. This war had cost both factions, he said, and the Larashi had proven their point. The ritual of Corral would be called off. Those who scourge would withdraw their fleets, and the Terrans would return to their systems, and 1,000 Confederation subcommittees would swoop in to provide aid to the war-torn nations. It was a good deal. Those who run had proven themselves unexpectedly vicious in battle, and had extended their holdings considerably from the conflict. Few fledgling races had managed to hold their own against those who scourge, and none of them had claimed territory in the process. Already, a number of nations had offered their allyship to the small race, eager to recreate those deadly ships for their own purposes. But small they were, a mere fraction of their aggressors, and no amount of tactical ingenuity or sheer righteous fury could close the gap. Those who run had stung the beast and turned it from its path, but they could not hope to maintain their success against the Larashi fighting to defend their heartlands. The deal they offered was the only real option. Under the eyes of 1,000 delegates, the Terran senator approached the Larashi. He drew a small scrap of fabric forth from his uniform. As he slowly unfolded the charred fragment, we realized what it was. Pulled from an expanse of blackened stone and glass stretching from one horizon to the other. All that was left of the flag of Avalon. He cast it at the Larashi senator's feet. "Karel," he said, "the blade cuts both ways. You began the ritual. You shall see it finished. Call not to your allies. The doors are closed to you now. Sue not for terms. They shall be denied. Flee to your dens, gather your strength, and make your stand. We are coming." The war continued. The Larashi tried every war trick that they had learned in 1,000 lifetimes. They laid elaborate traps, picked away at Terran fleets, made glorious last stands. The ships of humanity, dreadful dreadnoughts as they were, could still be tricked, trapped, dragged down by numbers. Their burnt-out husks became a common sight amongst Larashi territories. But it was never enough. The Terrans laid traps of their own, fought as well as those who scourge. Every Terran ship the Larashi burned took a score with them. And more than that was the sheer, overwhelming relentlessness. No matter how many were killed, more came in an endless tide. In ravaging those who run, those who scourge had stumbled across something completely unexpected, an equal in war. Perhaps a superior. And that was the true tragedy to the Larashi. If they had nurtured the humans, joined forces, they might have taken the Confederation itself. But in their pride they had wounded the beast, and now felt the full measure of its claws. Slowly, quietly, we and the other nations withdrew our offers of allyship to the Terrans. We had mourned them as victims, rooted for them as underdogs. Now we feared them as monsters. Belatedly, we remembered the Terran ambassador had said, this war and all that happened next would define the future of both races. We remembered how desperately he'd pled for peace. Only now did we realize what exactly he tried to hold back. The war continued. The Terrans got a hold in the Larashi territories and poured into the wound in droves. Those who Scourge could not stop them any more than they could stop the moons in their orbits. Humanity did not scourge the planets they captured. They merely burned their shipyards and launching zones, crippled their ability to mobilize, and moved on. As they blazed a line across the planets, their aim became clear: nothing less than the Larashi homeworld itself, Cotonant. The story of its fall threatens to become repetitive, an echo of the every battle before it, differing only in its tremendous scale. The Larashi fought with courage, ferocity, and desperation. It was not enough. On and on they came, until the Cotonant's glow orbit filled with charred metal and flesh. When the dawn rose on the Larashi's ancient homeworld, the sun shone haphazardly, filtered through the thick haze of war debris, and it dawned on a Terran flag. The war continued. Cotonant was theirs, so they had cut the Larashi to the quick. There was a furious counterattack, of course, but it was the fury of a wounded beast. The next strike was weaker, and the one after that. They are bleeding out now, on a slow spiral of extinction. But the Terrans were not content to wait. They had taken the homeworld, true, but they did not hold the planet responsible for the genocide of Avalon, nor did they blame the entirety of the Larashi race for the war crime. No, they knew where to lay the blame. The Larashi royal family, whose word had been law for time immemorial. It was on their orders that Avalon was burned. Bringing them to justice, however, proved difficult. Before the first Terran ship appeared in Cotonant skies, the royal family had quietly slipped away to a neighboring system. Their absence was not lost on the planet's defenders. Indeed, it was not an inconsiderable factor in their defeat. Still, humanity had been denied their true goal. So, they took that system too. Once more the nobility fled, and once more the Terrans followed. When that system had been taken in turn, the royal family split for better chances. Some disguised themselves and hid amongst the Larashi populace. Some paid enormous bribes to other nations to take them in violation of the ancient ritual. Some sought refuge with the pirates in outer fringes, who paid no lip service to Corral. Still, humanity did not relent. Where brute force did not suffice, they turned to cunning. Their agents infiltrated their haven and tracked down each offending member with an ability that bordered on uncanny. Those hiding amongst their own were extracted. The nations sheltering them were confronted, threatened with exposure, unless they were surrendered. Still, brute force had a use. At the fringes of known space, the Terrans ravaged the outlaws' fleet with a cruelty that those who Scourge could respect. They had started the war fighting pirates. Now, in its waning days, they found themselves fighting them once more. But now, they wielded an intent and fury the outlaws had never seen. Their every hidden holdout was rooted out and burned. It wasn't long before they gave up the nobles to stem the bloodshed. And even still, the war continued. The last free member of the Larashi royal family, the son of the ruling king, fled to the last holdout he had, the planet of Ublot, whose unique ionic atmosphere shortened out any technology more advanced than a sharpened stick. His ship fried to a dead hulk, his tools destroyed, he landed on Ublot's surface with nothing but a parachute and his skin. A one-way trip in every sense. But that was all right. He was of those who Scourge evolved to take its place in the top of the food chain. Ublot was a world dominated by dry, wind-scoured plains, but game would be found if one knew where to look. He could survive here, a banished prince, and keep a shred of his pride. The Terrans would not dare chase him to Ublot. Any who came after him would not be returning. They would have to content themselves with leaving him in exile. He held that certainty close to him. It warmed him on cold nights, gave him comfort in isolation. It kept him going for almost a full cycle, right up until he saw the Terran ship descending and felt it wither in his chest. The ship crashed, as they always did.
But like the prince, the pilot landed safely. A single, human, female, bringing nothing more than a flight suit and a single knife. She looked at her wreckage of a ship, her only hope of a journey home. Then she turned towards the endless plains, and she began to run. There are stories told of the long chase between those who scourge and those who run, where we, in the more romantic age, it would have been a stuff of myths, as it were. It was relegated merely to historical archives and melodrama. It went on for cycles. A planet is an unfathomably large span of travel on foot, and even though the Terran had landed as close to the Larashi ship as she could, that reduced it to merely a fraction of unfathomable. She had no devices with which to trace the prince, no vehicle, no medicine. But then again, neither did he. The Larashi are ambush predators, built for quick bursts of speed. They explode out of their prey, all claws and teeth, for that one short chase that determines life and death. A slow Larashi can outpace a fast human on their worst day. But humans are not built for bursts of speed. They are built for endurance, a fact that the prince slowly became aware of over his endless flight. The Terran ran slowly, but she simply didn't stop. The Larashi ran as far as his aching legs would take him, but every time he stopped to rest, the distance between them closed. He simply could not escape her. Neither could he avoid her. He used ancient tricks of the wild, crossing streams, avoiding soft ground, doubling back. He laid traps for the human, which as much ingenuity as he could conjure. But none of it worked. She could trace him by bending of twigs, the scent on the wind. She saw through his traps as though she had laid them herself. The Terrans had chosen their hunter with care. The Larashi prince, apex predator that he was, soon learned a human term: persistence hunting. Perhaps if he had faced her directly, he might have defeated her. At the end of things, he was still a killer by nature, and she was no more weapons than a knife. But his courage was gone, his pride broken, his homeland taken, his nation conquered. He could not hope to defeat her any more than his species could have defeated hers. In the end, all he could do was run. And she was much better at that. The Terran occupied every waking moment of his thoughts. He could not even escape her in his dreams. Closer and closer she came, until he ran himself ragged, until he clawed desperately through the desert, until he finally collapsed. When she finally arrived and put the knife to his throat, he was almost grateful. 10 years to the day the Terran ship had crashed on Ublat's shoals, a hole opened up in the planet's protective ionosphere. Not for long, barely time enough for a small craft to descend to the surface and return. But even as it touched down, two figures could be seen, a human and a Larashi captive, arriving at the predetermined landing site. The technology to defy Ublat's particular, prisonous atmosphere is not beyond imagination. It could be achieved by a vast team of scientists with the proper motivation, but it is an extraordinary expenditure of time and resources to capture a single individual. It seemed a fitting capstone for humanity's most revealing conflict, the lengths to which they would go to avenge their injustices. And at last, the war ended. We watched in the dead fascination as the humans determined the fate of the Larashi. The race was entirely at their mercy. They might claim their entire territory as the prize of war, or make vassals of them. Then again, enslaving the entire population was not out of the question, nor was a complete extermination. No act was taboo under Corral, and the Terrans had proved themselves a merciless species. But the humans did none of these. They imprisoned the royal family on charges of war crimes. They were shipped to the ruins of Avalon. Already, the humans had begun the arduous process of recultivating life on the ruined planet. Already, the first basic phages had begun to grow amid the glass and ash. It would take more than 1,000 cycles before the planet regained its former glory. but the Larashi royals would work its earth their entire lives to quicken the process. The remaining nobility, those with too tenuous a connection to claim complicity for Avalon, were gathered on Continent. The Larashi, whose royal dynasty stretched back unbroken through its entire recorded history, learned a human term that day: balkanization. Their mighty kingdom was splintered into a dozen minor nations whose petty feuds and infighting would undermine any attempt at a unified front. And like that, those who scourge would pose no more threat to any race. Perhaps someday a strong enough personality might unite the kingdoms once more. But it would be many cycles in the future, and they would think hard before attacking the humans again. On the floor of the Confederation, the Terran senator submitted a motion long in the making. The war had gone on long enough, he said, and they had proven their point. Carol would be ended. Aid could be given. The 12 new Larashi subdelegates raised no objection. And the hours afterwards, I had the opportunity to meet with the Terran ambassador over refreshments. Had his species barely won the conflict, he might have been swarmed by admirers and sycophants. But their overwhelming onslaught had earned more fear than respect, and so he sat alone. I summoned courage and approached him. He, in turn, welcomed the company. "You're braver than most," he said. "Before, we were weak, and I had many friends, but now that we are strong, and I foresee a lonely future." "Can you blame us?" I said. "We never could have imagined what you were capable of." "We haven't had to be warriors in a very long time," he said. "But we never forgot Hell. Her name is a promise after all." "Those who run?" He laughed. "No, not quite," he said. "That was a mistranslation from a malfunctioning device. By the time we realized the error, it seemed too trivial to correct." "A mistranslation?" He smiled, and for the first time I noticed the sharp teeth at the corners of his mouth. "It's not those who run," he said. "It's those who chase." End of story. I just quickly want to thank the Tier 5 patrons and channel members: Alithia Barkey, Cam Maxwell, Caspar Arnholtz, Albard and Guster, Arcadian, Lord Azrakal, and Joachim Backer.